This episode will contain some descriptions and details that some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Chapter 1. Alexander the Great.
In the shadow of mountains, and beside the coast of Cilicia, the fate of two empires clashed. One, a behemoth that had ruled for centuries. The other, a youthful ambition led by a man whose name would echo through time. Alexander the Great. This is the story of one of history's most decisive and dramatic battles, the Battle of Issus. To understand Alexander's greatness, we must begin with his extraordinary upbringing. Born in 356 BC in Pella, the capital of Macedon, Alexander was the son of King Philip II and Queen Olympias. From the start, he was surrounded by ambition, intellect, and conflict. His mother, a devout follower of mystic cults, instilled in him a belief in divine destiny. His father, a brilliant military leader, laid the foundations of Macedonian power. Alexander's education was nothing short of elite. At the age of 13, he was tutored by none other than Aristotle, one of the greatest philosophers in history. Under Aristotle, he studied philosophy, science, medicine, and literature, gaining a deep appreciation for Homer's Iliad, which he kept by his side for the rest of his life. One of the earliest stories that foreshadowed Alexander's future greatness involved a horse named Bucephalus. The horse was considered wild and untamable, feared even by seasoned handlers. But Alexander noticed something others didn't. The horse was afraid of its own shadow. Calmly and confidently, the young prince turned Bucephalus toward the sun, so its shadow was behind it. Then he mounted and rode the horse, stunning everyone watching. His father was glowing with pride, and when Alexander dismounted, he said,
"My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambition. Macedonia is too small for you."
This moment revealed not just his courage, but his insight and ability to lead through understanding rather than force. As a teenager, Alexander already showed signs of exceptional leadership. At 16, he was left in charge of Macedon while his father campaigned. During that time, he crushed a rebellion and founded a city, Alexandropolis. He also fought bravely at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, commanding the left wing and playing a key role in securing a decisive victory over the Greek city-states.
On one occasion, some ambassadors from the king of Persia arrived in Macedon, and since Philip was absent, Alexander received them in his place. He talked freely with them and quite won them over, not only by the friendliness of his manner, but also because he didn't trouble them with any childish or trivial inquiries, but questioned them about the distances they traveled by road, the nature of the journey through Persia, the character of the king, his experience in war, and the military strength of the Persians.
But Alexander's rise was not without turmoil. After Philip's assassination in 336 BC, possibly orchestrated with the knowledge of Olympias, Alexander moved quickly to eliminate rivals, secure loyalty from the Macedonian nobles, and assert control over the Greek city-states. Many saw him as too young, but he proved ruthlessly effective. He razed Thebes in 335 BC after a revolt, sending a message that his rule would not be challenged. With Greece pacified and his authority solidified, Alexander turned his gaze east, to the Persian Empire. What began as his father's campaign to punish Persia for past invasions now became Alexander's mission to conquer and surpass. While Alexander consolidated his power, the Persian Empire was a shadow of its former self. Darius III, though not lacking in courage, came to the throne through a series of palace intrigues. The once great Achaemenid Empire was plagued by internal unrest and disloyal satraps, yet its size and resources remained formidable. Spanning from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea, Persia boasted immense wealth and manpower. Darius, determined to halt Alexander's advance, assembled one of the largest armies the world had ever seen. His plan was simple: overwhelm the young invader with sheer numbers. After victories at the Granicus River and the liberation of Asia Minor's Greek cities, Alexander pushed south through Cilicia.
Darius, meanwhile, marched his army north, intent on cutting off Alexander's supply lines. The two forces converged near the narrow coastal plain of Issus, hemmed in by the sea and mountains. Darius commanded an enormous army, with some estimates being over 600,000 strong. Modern historians say the numbers are more in the range of 200,000 to 250,000. Alexander's forces numbered just 35,000 to 40,000 men. Alexander was clearly vastly outnumbered, by about 6 to 1, maybe more. Alexander knew he needed more than courage. He needed brilliance. The terrain at Issus, however, neutralized much of Darius's numerical advantage. The narrow plain would prevent the Persians from fully deploying their superior numbers. Alexander chose his ground well. By the fall of 333 BC, Alexander had already proven himself in battle at Granicus. But now he marched south through Cilicia, determined to find and defeat Darius. The Macedonian army, though vastly outnumbered, was lean, fast, and hardened from campaigning. Alexander himself led around 40,000 troops, a combination of Macedonian phalanx, cavalry, archers, and Greek allies. Darius, commanding an army perhaps 4 to 5 times larger, estimates range from 100,000 to even 600,000, according to some ancient sources, had positioned himself to crush Alexander before the young king could gain more ground. Darius had marched his forces to Sochi, expecting a confrontation in the open plains of Syria. However, Alexander had taken an unexpected route, moving his troops along the coast and through the narrow passes of the Taurus Mountains. Darius, realizing Alexander was now behind him, panicked. In a hurried reversal, he led his massive army north toward Issus, crossing the mountains through narrow paths that slowed his forces considerably. There, he seized the town of Issus and, crucially, captured some of Alexander's wounded soldiers who had been left behind. In a chilling display, Darius had these Macedonian soldiers mutilated. Their hands were cut off, and they were left to die in agony. It was an act meant to terrify and demoralize Alexander's army. But the effect was the opposite. Alexander, upon discovering the atrocity, was filled with rage. He vowed to bring Darius to justice, not just for the sake of empire, but for the blood of his men. This brutal act would serve to fuel the resolve of the Macedonian troops as they prepared for the coming clash. Strategically, both armies found themselves constrained by the terrain. The Gulf of Issus to the west and the Amanus Mountains to the east left a narrow plain for maneuvering, eliminating Darius's numerical advantage. Alexander recognized this immediately. While the Persians struggled to organize in the tight space, the Macedonians used their discipline and cohesion to prepare for a decisive strike. The days before the battle were marked by tense marches, poor weather, and intelligence blunders on the Persian side. Alexander maintained a relentless pace despite illness, and legend says that when he was gravely sick from exhaustion and drinking cold river water, his physician Philip of Acarnania treated him, while rumors spread of Persian poisoning. Alexander, showing complete trust, drank the medicine in front of his men, recovering swiftly and reinforcing his godlike aura among the troops. Both armies finally met near the Panaris River. The night before the battle, Alexander personally led a reconnaissance mission to survey the terrain. His camp buzzed with anticipation. Many soldiers knew they would face a far larger army the next day, but their confidence in Alexander remained unshaken. As night fell, Alexander toured his camp. He spoke with his men, offered prayers, and reminded them of their victories. To the Macedonians, he was more than a general. He was a brother in arms, a living legend. It is safe to say that many Macedonians were not just fighting for the glory of their country, but for Alexander himself. Alexander also led from the front.
He would be the first to charge, the first over the wall when attacking cities. He showed his men that he would face the danger with them. Alexander believed himself to be divinely blessed and sought glory in battle. He had faith that in glory lay immortality. Darius, by contrast, remained distant from his men. He commanded from a royal chariot surrounded by his elite guard and a lavish entourage. His army was vast, but it lacked the unity and trust. The Macedonian phalanx was the core of Alexander's infantry, a living wall of bristling sarissas trained to move and strike as one. These soldiers were professionals, veterans of multiple campaigns, and the embodiment of discipline. But even the best-trained troops need spirit and conviction before facing overwhelming odds. On the eve of battle, Alexander walked among his men, not as a distant king, but as a brother in arms. He called many by name, inquired about their families, and reminded them of their victories at Granicus and Halicarnassus. He reminded them that they were no longer fighting for mere survival. They were writing the future of the known world. To rally their spirits, Alexander delivered a rousing speech. According to Arrian and other ancient historians, he said,
Remember that you are free men, fighting not just for yourselves, but for all of Greece. We face men who fight for gold and kingship. We fight for glory, for legacy, for the honor of Macedon and the souls of our fallen comrades. Remember to preserve discipline in the hour of danger, to advance in utter silence, and when the moment comes to roar out and put the fear of God into the enemy's hearts, remember that on the conduct of each depends the fate of all. Our enemies are men who over centuries have led soft and luxurious lives. We of Macedonia have trained in the hard school of danger and war. And what of the two men in supreme command? They have Darius. You have Alexander.
His officers, including Parmenion and Philotas, also addressed the ranks. Parmenion reportedly urged the men to remember the courage that had brought them through hostile territory and to trust in their king. Alexander's charisma was as potent as his sword. He radiated confidence, youth, and destiny. To many of his men, he was more than human. Some believed he was descended from Achilles, others from Zeus himself. And when they saw their king put on his bronze armor, gleaming in the dawn light, and mount Bucephalus at the head of the right wing, they believed no force on earth could stop them. The combination of iron discipline and unshakable morale would prove decisive in the hours to come. At dawn, Alexander arranged his troops with precision. The right wing, under his personal command, would deliver the main strike. The left, under Parmenion, would hold against the Persian cavalry. The Macedonian phalanx formed the core, a bristling wall of 18-foot sarissas, advancing with machine-like discipline. These heavily armed infantrymen, trained since youth, operated as a single, deadly organism. The battle began with both sides launching missile fire across the river. Alexander waited for the moment of weakness, then surged forward with his cavalry. The honor of the right side now became a spearhead of shock and terror. The phalanx advanced steadily behind, pinning the center. Though Parmenion's forces were pressured hard, they held long enough for Alexander to break through the left and turn the tide. Alexander led the charge. With his companion cavalry, he smashed into the Persian left and punched toward the center. This was not just brute force. It was brilliant choreography under pressure. Alexander's direct leadership, his flexible tactics, and the loyalty of his troops allowed him to punch through the larger army. As the battle commenced, Persian archers and cavalry clashed with Parmenion's flank. The line buckled, but held. The shock of the charge shattered the Persian line. Chaos rippled through Darius's ranks. As Alexander drew close, Darius, fearing capture, turned and fled. His royal guard followed, triggering retreat. Persian army dissolved. Macedonians chased down fleeing soldiers. An army is most vulnerable in retreat, and the Macedonians took full advantage. Darius's mother, wife, and daughters were captured. They believed that they were doomed to a horrible death or worse. Yet, on the contrary, Alexander treated them with dignity and respect, calling them royal women and protecting their honor. Alexander entered Darius's tent and went to the bath area. He unbuckled his armor and said,
"Let us wash off the sweat of battle in Darius's bath."
One of his companions then replied,
"No, in Alexander's bath now. The conqueror takes over the possessions of the conquered, and they shall be called his."
After Alexander admired all of the vast treasures, ornaments made of solid gold, and taking in the smells of perfumes and spices, he remarked to his companions,
"So this, it seems, is what it is to be a king."
More than a victory, Issus was a statement. The old empire was crumbling. One of the most poignant moments followed the battle. When Darius's mother, Sisygambis, mistakenly bowed to Hephaestion instead of Alexander, the king gently corrected her, saying,
"You were not mistaken, mother. He too is Alexander."
It was a rare glimpse into the personal depth of a man, often defined by war. After the battle, Alexander concerned himself with his own men. He made the effort to visit all of his wounded. As well as showing his deepest concerns, he also asked them how they received their wounds and allowed them to exaggerate the tales as much as they pleased. He offered encouragement, joked with them, and praised their bravery. The next day, all the dead were buried with their arms by order of Alexander. Their parents and children back in Macedonia were granted immunity from local taxes. The Battle of Issus was not merely a victory, it was a turning point. Alexander had defeated the Persian king, captured his family, and shattered the illusion of Persian invincibility. The young Macedonian was no longer a challenger, he was a conqueror. Following the battle, Alexander marched south. City after city surrendered. Tyre and Gaza resisted and paid a heavy price. Tyre was besieged for 7 months and ultimately razed. Gaza fell after a brutal campaign. In Egypt, Alexander was welcomed as a liberator. He founded the city of Alexandria, destined to become one of the greatest centers of learning and culture in the ancient world. At the Oracle of Siwa, deep in the desert, Alexander was declared the son of Zeus Ammon. Whether he believed it or used it politically, the divine aura only enhanced his mystique.
His age gives added luster to his achievements, for, though hardly old enough for such undertakings, he was well up to them. There are things generally regarded as rather unimportant, but which are appreciated by soldiers. The fact that he exercised with his men, that he made his appearance little different from an ordinary citizen, that he had the energy of a soldier. These characteristics, whether they were natural or consciously cultivated, made him in the eyes of his men as much a matter of affection as of awe.
Darius sent a message offering all of his empire west from the river Euphrates in exchange for peace. Alexander's leading general Parmenion advised him to accept. Alexander said,
"If I was Parmenion, I would, but I am Alexander and will not."
In 331 BC, Alexander would face Darius again at the Battle of Gaugamela, a more decisive engagement than Issus. Once more, Darius fled. Soon after, he was betrayed and murdered by his own men. Alexander, upon finding the body, gave Darius a royal funeral and hunted down his killers, portraying himself as the avenger of a fallen king and the rightful heir to the Persian throne. With the Persian Empire under his control, Alexander pushed further east. He fought brutal campaigns in Central Asia, marrying Roxana, a Bactrian princess, to unite cultures. But his ambition did not end there. In 326 BC, he crossed into India and faced King Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes River. Though victorious, the battle was costly. His troops, exhausted and longing for home, mutinied at the Hyphasis River. Alexander relented. On the return journey, he nearly died crossing the Gedrosian desert. Upon returning to Babylon, he began grand plans. A unified empire, new cities, mixed marriages, and cultural fusion. But he would not live to see them realized. In 323 BC, at the age of just 32, Alexander the Great died, possibly from fever, poisoning, or pre-existing conditions. His body, preserved in honey, was taken to Egypt. His empire, without a clear successor, was carved up by his generals. Alexander's legacy is unparalleled. He changed the world in a single decade, spreading Greek language, culture, and thought across 3 continents. The Hellenistic world that followed laid the foundations for modern science, philosophy, and art. Yet his story remains a paradox. A man who wept when there were no more worlds to conquer, a ruthless warlord and a visionary statesman, a destroyer of cities and a founder of civilizations. To truly understand Alexander's legacy, we must hear from those who stood beside him, admired him, and sometimes feared him.
He considered nothing impossible to the courageous and aspired to deeds greater than human.
When Alexander led us into battle, we were not afraid. His presence was a force greater than numbers.
We follow him not just because he wins, but because he believes we can do the impossible.
Alexander's reputation continued to inspire centuries after his death. Julius Caesar is said to have wept with envy upon seeing a statue of Alexander, lamenting,
"Before Alexander had died, aged just 32, he had conquered most of the known world, and I have achieved nothing."
No other mortal ever inspired such fear in the hearts of kings, or such loyalty from common men.
The earth seemed too small for him. He sought new worlds when there were none.
He endured more than his soldiers, marched further, and demanded from others only what he had already conquered in himself.
And from Alexander himself,
"I would rather live a short life of glory than a long one of obscurity."
he was not just a general, he was a myth in the making, a man whose charisma, brilliance, and ambition carved his name into the stone of eternity. From the dust of Issus to the sands of India, Alexander left behind a world forever altered, and a name that history will never forget.
Chapter 2. Sir William Wallace.
They called him a freedom fighter. England called him a traitor. But most of what you think you know about William Wallace probably isn't true. Here's what the 1995 Hollywood movie Braveheart didn't tell you about the real William Wallace and how his brutal death shook Scotland to its core. This is the story of a man who was born with nothing but changed everything. A story buried beneath legend, adapted and brought to the big screen by Hollywood, and to this day is studied and debated. From his mysterious beginnings, to the battles he led, to the unspeakable horror of his final days, this is the life and death of Sir William Wallace. If you've seen the 1995 film Braveheart, starring and directed by Mel Gibson, you probably picture Wallace as a wild-haired rebel in a kilt, shouting about freedom with his face painted blue. And although this image is now iconic, epic even, the problem is, most of that is fiction. The real Wallace didn't wear a kilt. He didn't paint his face. He didn't father the future King of Scotland. And he sure as hell didn't win every battle he fought. The truth is murkier and way more interesting. To understand Wallace, we have to look past the legend and dig into 13th century Scotland, a land fractured by war, controlled by nobles, dominated by England, a place where speaking out could get you executed. And it's here somewhere in the chaos that Wallace appears. Not born into power, not from a royal family, just a man, caught in the middle of something way bigger than himself. Let's start with what we think we know. William Wallace was likely born around 1270. The exact year? Nobody's sure. The exact location? Even less clear. Some say he was born in Elderslie, Renfrewshire. Others argue for Ellerslie in Ayrshire. His early life is mostly a mystery. Most likely he wasn't a high-ranking noble, but wasn't a peasant either. His father may have been a knight or minor landowner named Malcolm Wallace. That would have given young William a decent upbringing, educated, maybe even taught Latin and swordplay from a young age. Not the poor farmer with humble beginnings that Hollywood portrayed. There's no evidence he was poor or untrained. And the idea that he was some kind of Highlander outlaw? That's pure myth. We don't get any solid records about him until the 1290s. So what was he doing before that? Possibly training, watching, learning, waiting. And then everything changed. Scotland wasn't a united country in the way we think of nations today. It was a patchwork of feudal loyalties, clan rivalries, and fragile truces. When King Alexander III of Scotland died in 1286, followed by his heir, the Maid of Norway, just 4 years later, Scotland fell into a succession crisis. There was no clear ruler. That's when King Edward I of England stepped in. Edward was no pushover. Nicknamed Longshanks for his height, and Hammer of the Scots for his brutality, he was a seasoned warrior, king who saw Scotland's instability as an opportunity. He invited the Scottish nobles to swear allegiance to him. Some did, others hesitated. And then Edward installed John Balliol as a puppet king, one he could control. It didn't last. Edward soon humiliated Balliol, stripped him of power, and brought Scotland under direct English rule. That's when the real resistance began. Wallace's first major appearance in history comes in 1297. According to chroniclers, he'd already been resisting English control for some time. One famous, but unverified story claims he killed an English sheriff in Lanark after the man murdered his wife. It's dramatic, romantic, and definitely inspired the main plot of Braveheart. But there's no solid evidence that this ever happened. Until 1297, William Wallace was almost invisible to official records. And that's not surprising. He wasn't a noble, nor was he a knight at this time, and he wasn't part of any major Scottish clan power structure. But that year, everything changed. And it started with a murder. Now, most of what we know or think we know about Wallace's early actions comes from a poet named Blind Harry, who wrote a romanticized account of Wallace's life in the 1400s, over 150 years after Wallace died. So take this story with a pinch of salt, but not too much, because there are official English records that back up parts of it. And honestly, even if it's legend, it tells us how people wanted to remember Wallace. So here's the tale. Wallace was living quietly near Lanark, a small Scottish town under the control of the English. At the time, many English garrisons were stationed in Scottish towns, and tensions were boiling over. According to Blind Harry, Wallace had recently fallen in love with a young woman named Marion Braidfute, the daughter of a minor noble. She may have lived at Lanark Castle, or perhaps in a nearby estate. Some versions call her his wife. Others say she was just someone he was courting. Either way, and this part is key, she was important to him. Now, Wallace wasn't exactly hiding his distaste for English rule. He'd been involved in minor skirmishes, harassing soldiers. He may have even led small raids on supply wagons. He was becoming a problem. Enter Sir William Heselrigg, the English-appointed sheriff of Lanark, a harsh enforcer of Edward's rule. One night, Wallace and some fellow rebels raided an English patrol in the area. In the skirmish, English troops were killed. Word got back to Heselrigg. He wanted revenge. Another account tells the tale that an argument escalated over the price of a fish, and in the heat of the confrontation, Wallace killed an English guard and fled. While Wallace was away, Heselrigg and his men raided Marian's home. Depending on the version, they either arrested her or murdered her outright. Some say she was dragged into the streets and killed to send a message to Wallace. Others say she was executed as an accessory to rebellion. Either way, Wallace returned to find her dead. And that was it. No more hiding, no more waiting. Blinded by rage, Wallace gathered a small group of loyal men. No army, just a band of outlaws. That night, they stormed Lanark Castle. The garrison was caught off guard. The attack was fast, brutal, and personal. Some say that Wallace killed Heselrigg himself, and that Wallace didn't just kill him, but hacked him to pieces. According to one chronicler,
he hewed him all to pieces and left not a limb upon another.
this was personal warfare, fueled by grief and fury. The English soldiers in the castle either fled or were cut down. Wallace and his men lit fires, burned the outbuildings, and slipped away into the night. The murder of an English sheriff was no small act. It was an outright declaration of war. And for the first time, Wallace's name was written down in official English records. He was now considered an outlaw, a traitor, a terrorist. There was a bounty on his head. But in the eyes of many Scots, he was a hero. Now, let's be clear. We don't have court records or eyewitness testimony of what happened that night. The earliest accounts are based on oral tradition and patriotic poetry. But the English did record the death of Sheriff Heselrigg in 1297. So something happened in Lanark. And whether Wallace attacked to avenge a lover, a wife, or simply to strike a blow against English oppression, this was his first major act of rebellion. It lit a fuse. If the story of Wallace killing Sheriff Heselrigg is the spark that started his rebellion, then the tale of Marion Braidfute is the emotional fuel that made it burn. But here's the thing. We don't actually know if Marion was real. There are no English records of a Marion Braidfute, no marriage documents, no legal land ownership tied to her name, nothing concrete. Her story comes almost entirely from the 15th century poem The Wallace by Blind Harry. As mentioned earlier, a wildly popular and deeply patriotic retelling of Wallace's life, written over 150 years after his death. That doesn't mean the story is fake, but it definitely means it was shaped for effect. And what an effect it had. So who was Marion Braidfute? According to Blind Harry, Marion was the daughter of Sir Hugh Braidfute, a noble landowner in Lanark. Some versions of the tale say Wallace and Marion met in secret, that she hid him when English soldiers came searching, and that they fell in love quietly, away from the politics and bloodshed. Others say she was Wallace's wife, and that they had been secretly married before the sheriff's men attacked her estate. In Blind Harry's version, she's not just a love interest, she's a symbol of innocence and home. The one soft thing in Wallace's otherwise hard and violent life. And when she's murdered by the English, specifically on orders from Sheriff Heselrigg, it turns Wallace from a reluctant rebel into a man with nothing to lose. It's the classic, tragic origin story. Think of it as Scotland's medieval version of John Wick. They took the one thing he loved and made it personal. So was any of this true? Maybe. It's entirely possible that Wallace did have a lover or wife. It's even possible she was killed in an English raid. Sadly, things like that happened all the time in occupied towns like Lanark. But the exact name, identity, and details? Almost certainly legend. That doesn't mean it wasn't powerful, though. In fact, the myth of Marion Bradefeud became one of the most important emotional threads in Wallace's story, especially centuries later, when storytellers looked to bring Wallace back into the spotlight. Fast forward to 1995, when Mel Gibson released Braveheart and the love story with Murren, a Hollywood version of Marion, became the emotional centerpiece of the entire first act. In the film, Murren is portrayed as Wallace's secret bride, gentle, kind, and everything good in the world he's fighting to protect. When English soldiers attack her, she's captured and executed in public. Wallace then slaughters the English garrison in a fit of rage and disappears into the hills to start his rebellion. Sound familiar? That's Blind Harry, almost word for word. And even though historians rolled their eyes at the inaccuracy, audiences loved it, because emotionally, it worked. It gave Wallace a deeply human reason to fight. Not just politics, not just freedom, but love, vengeance, heartbreak. It made the rebellion about more than nations, it made it personal. And maybe that's why the story's stuck for so long. Even if it's not historically confirmed, it gave Scotland a tragic love story at the heart of its national myth. A story of a man who fought not just for a country, but for the woman he lost. Today in Lanark, there's a plaque dedicated to the spot where Marion was supposedly buried. Local tradition holds that Wallace avenged her death right there in the streets. The stories become part of Lanark's identity. And across Scotland, Marion Bradefeud is still remembered in books, plays, and films, not because many believe that her existence has been proven, but because she represents something real: the personal cost of war, the people left behind, the lives cut short, the love that couldn't survive the violence. In that sense, whether she existed or not, Marion's story is true. Because it speaks to something deeper than fact. It speaks to the kind of pain that turns ordinary people into legends. After Lanark, Wallace went into open resistance. No more hiding, no more hit-and-run tactics. He joined up with other rebel leaders, names like William Douglas the Hardy, Andrew Murray, and James the Steward. They were rising too, but Wallace's fame was spreading fastest. Because his rebellion wasn't just military, it was emotional. He wasn't just fighting for land or titles. He was fighting for something the people could feel: dignity, justice, revenge, and freedom. And the next phase of his fight was going to get a whole lot bigger. What is documented is Wallace joining forces with other rebels and attacking English garrisons. He wasn't alone. Other Scots were rising too, but Wallace stood out. Why? Because unlike most Scottish nobles, he didn't play politics. He didn't hedge bets. He picked a side and fought with everything he had. His biggest moment came in September 1297 at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. It was the battle that turned William Wallace from a rebel into a legend. Forget what you saw in Braveheart. There's no open field, no blue face paint, no dramatic pre-battle monologue, and absolutely no charge across grassy plains with horses and broadswords. The real Battle of Stirling Bridge was way more clever and way more brutal. It was a textbook example of asymmetric warfare. A small, scrappy force of Scots defeating a much larger, better armed, better equipped English army. Not with brute force, but with tactics. with patience, with terrain, with a trap. By late 1297, Scotland was on fire. Wallace wasn't the only rebel leader. Across the country, uprisings were breaking out, English strongholds were under siege, English lords were nervous. And the Scots, after years of humiliation under Edward I, were finally pushing back. But Wallace had something that set him apart: momentum. After the attack at Lanark, he joined forces with Andrew Moray, another rising rebel leader from the north. Moray was young, determined, and just as anti-English as Wallace. Together they gathered an army, peasants, freemen, and minor nobles. They weren't well armed. Many of them didn't even have armor. Most had spears, farm tools, and whatever they could carry, but what they did have was a cause. And under Wallace and Moray, they marched to Stirling, the key to central Scotland. Why did Stirling matter? Stirling was more than just a town. It was the gateway to the north. Whoever controlled the Stirling Bridge controlled movement between southern and northern Scotland. It was a natural choke point, flanked by bogs, hills, and the winding River Forth. If the English wanted to crush the rebellion, they'd have to cross that bridge. And Wallace knew it. The English force, led by John de Warenne, the Earl of Surrey, and Hugh de Cressingham, Edward's treasurer in Scotland, numbered between 6,000 and 10,000 troops. That included heavy cavalry, archers, and well-trained infantry. The Scots had maybe 2,000 to 4,000 men at most. Surrey's men were confident, cocky even. After all, this was a rabble of farmers and rebels. What could they possibly do against one of the most disciplined armies in Europe? But Wallace wasn't planning to fight them head-on. He had something else in mind. The bridge was a natural bottleneck. The Stirling Bridge wasn't a wide crossing, it was narrow, only about 2 horses wide. And it sat on wooden stilts over the River Forth, which was deep, fast-moving, and surrounded by marshes and steep ground. Wallace and Moray camped on high ground north of the river near Abbey Craig, overlooking the bridge. They could see everything the English were doing, every troop movement, every supply cart, every hesitation. The English were camped on the south side of the river, eager to cross and crush the rebels. But the Scots didn't move. They waited, and waited, for days. Surrey wanted to negotiate. Wallace refused. He was buying time and waiting for the English to make a fatal mistake. And then the trap would be sprung. Finally, on the morning of the 11th of September, the English commanders made their move. They began crossing the bridge slowly. Only a few men could cross at a time. The cavalry had to dismount. The infantry formed columns. And here's where Wallace struck. He waited until just over 2,000 English troops, a small portion of their full army, had crossed the bridge and reached the north bank. Then he attacked. Wallace and Moray led a sudden ferocious charge from the high ground. Their men slammed into the English like a hammer. There was nowhere to retreat. The bridge behind them was jammed, and the river beside them was too deep and fast to swim. Panic set in. The English soldiers were trapped. They couldn't maneuver. Their heavy armor made them slow, and Wallace's men fought with desperation and fury. The Scots cut them down, shoved them into the river, smashed them against the muddy banks. Men drowned, horses panicked. English officers tried to regroup, but the terrain made it impossible. In less than an hour, most of the English vanguard was slaughtered. And as if that wasn't enough, Wallace then ordered the bridge to be destroyed. The remaining English troops, watching from the south side, could do nothing but stare as their comrades died screaming in the river. It was a massacre. In the end, tactics mattered. Let's be clear, Wallace didn't win because of some miracle. He won because of brilliant tactics. He used the terrain to neutralize the English numbers, waited until a portion of their army was isolated and vulnerable, attacked from a higher position, giving his infantry more force on impact, controlled the timing of the fight to his advantage, weaponized the bridge itself, turning it into a trap, not a pathway. It wasn't brute strength, it was a calculated ambush, designed to exploit the English commander's arrogance and impatience. And it worked perfectly. The victory at Stirling Bridge was a massive embarrassment for Edward I. His army had been defeated by an outlaw. His treasurer, Hugh de Cressingham, had been killed and flayed. Legend says Wallace had his skin cut off and turned into a sword belt or a scabbard. Was that true? Hard to say. But the message was clear. The Scots weren't just fighting, they were fighting angrily. Stirling gave the rebellion real momentum. Wallace was now seen not just as a raider, but as a military leader. After the battle, he was appointed Guardian of Scotland, essentially acting head of state on behalf of the deposed King John Balliol. He was still a commoner, still not a noble. But now he was the most powerful man in Scotland. It was the high point of his life. It was one of Scotland's greatest victories. A brilliant military tactic. A turning point. He'd gone from shadowy rebel to national hero. But like most highs in Wallace's story, it wouldn't last. Wallace wanted to keep the pressure on, so in late 1297 he led a raid into northern England. But instead of a precise campaign, it turned into something more brutal: raids, burnings, executions. This wasn't a clean fight. It was medieval war, ugly, bloody, and ruthless. Wallace had seen what the English did in Scotland. Now he was bringing that same terror to their lands. In Braveheart, Wallace is shown as a pure-hearted warrior, but in real life, he was willing to do whatever it took. Even if that meant killing civilians, even if it meant burning towns. It's here we see Wallace not just as a hero, but as a man hardened by war. And then came Falkirk. After the stunning victory at Stirling Bridge, William Wallace was on top of the world. He had the trust of the people, the fear of the English, and the momentum of a movement. But that success came with a price. The English crown wasn't going to let Wallace humiliate them and walk away. Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, was furious. And unlike his commanders at Stirling, Edward was no amateur. He was a seasoned military strategist. The same man who had crushed Welsh resistance, fought in the Crusades, and built a war machine fueled by taxes, terror, and sheer ambition. And now, he was coming north. In the summer of 1298, Edward personally led a massive English invasion into Scotland, a full-scale military campaign to crush Wallace once and for all. He brought 2,000 heavy cavalry knights on horseback, 10,000 infantry, including hardened mercenaries, and his secret weapon, the English longbowmen. Wallace, meanwhile, had managed to gather an army estimated between 6,000 and 8,000 men, mostly infantry and spearmen. Some nobles supported him, but many stayed on the sidelines, or worse, played both sides, hoping to survive no matter who won. On July the 22nd, 1298, near the small town of Falkirk, Wallace made his stand. Wallace knew he was outnumbered and outmatched in cavalry and armor. So he did what any clever commander would do. He leaned on defensive tactics. He arranged his men into 4 large skiltrons, massive circular formations of spearmen, with wooden stakes driven into the ground and spears pointed outward in every direction. Think of them as spiky hedgehogs designed to hold firm against cavalry. In the gaps between the schiltrons, Wallace placed archers mostly from the forest of Ettrick, and behind them, a small, underwhelming group of Scottish horsemen. The entire formation was arranged on marshy ground, which Wallace hoped would slow down the English knights and neutralize their power. It was smart, but it wasn't enough. Edward didn't take the bait. He didn't charge his cavalry straight into the spikes. Instead, he unleashed his longbowmen, and that changed everything. The Welsh and English archers fired wave after wave of arrows into the packed Scottish formations. The schiltrons were tight, designed to repel cavalry, not arrows. With no proper shields or armor, the Scots were ripped apart from a distance. It was a bloodbath, and Wallace couldn't stop it. His own archers weren't numerous or powerful enough to counterattack, and his cavalry, led by Scottish nobles, abandoned the field early in the battle. Some historians think they panicked. Others believe they never fully supported Wallace to begin with. Either way, Wallace's flank collapsed, and that opened the door for Edward's knights. With the Scottish schiltrons weakened and demoralized, Edward ordered a full cavalry assault. This time, it worked. The heavy horses smashed into the remaining formations. Spears broke. Lines collapsed. The tight defensive circles disintegrated under pressure, arrows and steel. The field was soon littered with bodies. Wallace's army was decimated. Thousands died. Others fled. And Wallace somehow survived. He escaped the battlefield and disappeared into the forest. But the damage was done. The loss at Falkirk crushed Wallace's military reputation. By the end of 1298, he resigned as Guardian of Scotland. He wasn't executed, he wasn't exiled. But politically, he was sidelined. Scottish nobles, including Robert the Bruce and John Comyn, took over the leadership. Wallace faded from the public eye. He wouldn't be heard from again for 7 years. Let's talk about Braveheart for a moment. In the film, the Battle of Falkirk ends with Wallace charging into battle heroically, only to be betrayed mid-fight by Scottish cavalry, who retreat instead of attacking. Worse, it's revealed that one of the knights leading the betrayal is Robert the Bruce himself. In the movie, this is devastating. Wallace is wounded, heartbroken, and horrified. He realizes the nobles he trusted are more loyal to power than to freedom. It's a powerful scene, but it's totally fictional. Here's the truth. Robert the Bruce likely wasn't even at the Battle of Falkirk. There is no evidence he fought for the English, and there is zero historical proof that he betrayed Wallace in any way. In fact, Robert the Bruce had already been showing signs of rebellion against Edward I by that time. The film twisted the timeline and events for dramatic effect, combining different betrayals, political indecision, and character arcs into one symbolic moment. It makes for great cinema and engaging storytelling, but it does a disservice to Bruce's legacy. Because, as we'll see later, Robert the Bruce would become the man who finally defeated England and won Scotland's independence, a goal Wallace never lived to see. And also, the name Braveheart was actually given to Robert the Bruce, not William Wallace. After Robert the Bruce died, James Douglas, who was a close friend, honored his dying wish by taking his heart on crusade. In southern Spain, fighting the Moors, the Scots were surrounded. It is said that James threw the casket containing Bruce's heart towards the enemy, shouting,
"Onwards, brave heart, Douglas shall follow thee or die."
So, why did Wallace lose at Falkirk? A few reasons. Superior English firepower. The longbowmen were devastating. They tore through lightly armored Scots before the hand-to-hand fighting even started. Lack of cavalry support. Wallace didn't have enough mounted troops to strike back, and those he did have led by the nobility abandoned the field. Wallace was never fully trusted by the higher nobility. They may have tolerated him, but they didn't always back him. Wallace's defeat at Falkirk was the beginning of the end for him politically, but not spiritually. He never swore loyalty to Edward. He never gave up the cause. And although he no longer held power, his name still carried weight. He would soon vanish into the shadows, only to reappear 7 years later in chains. But the dream he fought for didn't die at Falkirk. It just changed hands. For 7 years, Wallace vanished from public view. Some say he went to France to seek support. Others claim he fought a guerrilla war from the shadows. We don't know for sure. But in 1305, the English wasted no time. They dragged Wallace to London in chains. There'd be no trial, no defense, only spectacle. When William Wallace was finally captured in August 1305, there was no great battle, no heroic last stand, no escape. He was reportedly taken near Glasgow by English forces after being betrayed by a fellow Scot, Sir John de Menteith, the governor of Dumbarton Castle, a man who had previously fought alongside Wallace, but had since pledged loyalty to Edward I. That betrayal cut deeper than any sword. Wallace had spent years fighting for a free Scotland, only to be sold out by one of his own. To the English, it was a massive victory. Wallace had become more than just a rebel. He was a living symbol, a myth. Capturing him was like capturing the soul of the rebellion. At this point in 1305, the rebellion had been on life support for years. Scotland was fractured. The nobility had bent the knee. So Edward I decided to destroy him, not just physically, but symbolically. This wouldn't be a simple hanging. This would be a performance, a warning, a public display of what happens to anyone who defies the crown. He was transported under heavy guard from Scotland to London, across hundreds of miles, not to be imprisoned, not to be negotiated with, but to be made an example of. But for the Scots, he was still a symbol of resistance. And Edward wanted to erase that symbol. When Wallace arrived in London in late August, crowds lined the streets. Most had never seen him, but they'd heard the stories. Some cheered, some jeered. He was paraded before them in a cruel public display, not as a prisoner of war, but as a criminal. He was taken to Westminster Hall. It was a symbolic location. This was the heart of English law, power, and monarchy. But this wasn't a trial in any real sense. He wasn't allowed to speak in his defense. He wasn't allowed counsel. No jury, no defense, no justice. Just a list of accusations read aloud by English judges. The charges were long: treason, murder, arson, robbery, rebellion. Wallace's response, according to the record:
I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject.
It was true. Wallace had never sworn fealty to Edward. He considered himself loyal only to Scotland. But Edward didn't care. The verdict was already decided. Guilty. And the punishment was the worst England had to offer. The most brutal execution the English crown could legally carry out. Wallace was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This wasn't just execution, it was the ultimate form of state cruelty, designed not just to kill, but to destroy a person so completely, no one would dare follow in their footsteps. On the morning of August 23rd, Wallace was stripped naked, tied to a wooden hurdle a flatboard, and dragged by a team of horses through the filthy streets of London. From the Tower of London to Smithfield for nearly 2 miles, people spat at him, threw waste, jeered, and screamed. But others were silent. Not everyone saw a monster. Some saw a martyr. This journey was brutal in itself. He was bounced, battered, and humiliated. He was tied so tightly that the ropes would have cut into his skin. By the time he arrived at Smithfield, he was bruised, bleeding, and probably semi-conscious. But that was only the beginning. At Smithfield, Wallace was then hanged by the neck, but carefully, deliberately, cut down before he could die. The idea wasn't to kill him quickly. It was to bring him to the edge of death, and then keep going. By this point, Wallace was likely semi-conscious, gasping for air, muscles twitching from lack of oxygen. But the horror would continue. The next stage, dismemberment, while still alive. Wallace was then disemboweled. His abdomen was sliced open. His intestines pulled out slowly, inch by inch, and burned before his eyes while he was still breathing. There are reports that his genitals were also cut off, a symbolic attack on his manhood, his bloodline, his very identity. These were then also thrown into the fire, and he was forced to watch it all. Some in the crowd laughed, some cheered, but not all. Chroniclers noted that even hardened witnesses were sickened by what they saw. There was a hush as the execution went on, not reverence, but revulsion. People had come to see a spectacle, but they got something else, a slow-motion execution that went too far, even by medieval standards. One chronicler described it as
the most terrible of deaths, met with the most unyielding resolve.
Wallace, according to some sources, never begged. He never cried out. He never asked for mercy. Whether that's true or part of the myth, we'll never know. But it's how he's remembered. Only after the torture had gone on long enough, and only when death was unavoidable after this prolonged agony, was he finally beheaded. His head was removed and held aloft for the crowd to see. It was a final act of mercy. But it wasn't the end. Not for Wallace. Not for the message Edward wanted to send. The final stage was the quartering. His body was cut into 4 parts, arms, legs, severed from the torso. This wasn't just mutilation. This was symbolic dismemberment, taking the man who once united a nation and breaking him into pieces. His head was dipped in tar to preserve it, and placed on a spike atop London Bridge, a warning to all who crossed. It was left to rot in public view. It stayed there until the elements and the birds stripped it bare. The rest of his body was scattered. 1/4 of his body was sent to Newcastle, a key English town near the Scottish border. Another was sent to Berwick upon Tweed, a contested city that had changed hands during the wars. A third was sent to Stirling, where Wallace had won his greatest victory. The final 1/4 was sent to Perth, once a Scottish stronghold, places where Wallace had fought or held influence. His death was meant to destroy the myth of William Wallace, but it only strengthened it. Even in death, he defied Edward. Edward wanted to erase Wallace. Instead, he immortalized him. The brutal execution didn't end the rebellion, it inspired it. Wallace became a martyr, his courage etched into the national memory of Scotland. Even English chroniclers who despised Wallace recorded the shock and horror of what was done. One medieval account said,
He died in great torment, but bore it with dignity.
To this day, Wallace's execution remains one of the most barbaric state-sanctioned deaths in British history. And incredibly, no full remains were ever buried. No grave, no tomb, no resting place, His head was eventually replaced on the London Bridge spike by the heads of other rebels. His body scattered and forgotten. But his name, that was carved into stone. King Edward wanted to wipe Wallace's name from history, to frighten Scotland into obedience. But it didn't work. Wallace's brutal death didn't end the fight, it only made it more personal. It showed the world that England could kill the man, but not the idea. And that idea, freedom, identity, defiance, spread. Edward I died just 2 years later, in 1307. He never saw Scotland defeated. Because Wallace's death planted a seed that would grow into full-blown rebellion. In Braveheart, Wallace's final word is "freedom," shouted in agony as he's executed. There's no historical record that he actually said that. However, in the end, his death meant freedom. Not immediately, not easily, but eventually. Robert the Bruce, inspired in part by Wallace, would go on to lead Scotland to victory at Bannockburn in 1314 and secure Scotland's independence. Wallace never lived to see it, but his death helped make it possible. Wallace's death didn't stop the rebellion, it only fueled it. Then, in 1995, Mel Gibson brought that symbol to a global audience with Braveheart. The film won Oscars. It inspired millions, but it also rewrote history. Let's clear a few things up. Wallace didn't wear a kilt. They didn't exist in that form yet. Face paint? That was used by ancient Picts, not 13th century Scots. He didn't have an affair with the Princess of Frances, was about 9 years old and living in France at the time, and most likely never even met Wallace. He wasn't a lone warrior. He had allies, co-leaders, and fellow rebels. And as we have already covered, Robert the Bruce didn't betray him at Falkirk. In fact, Bruce likely wasn't even there. But Braveheart did one thing right. It captured the feeling of Wallace's legacy, his passion, his pain, his refusal to kneel. It was also a master-crafted piece of cinema, full of passion, drama, high stakes, spectacle, inspiration, and most of all, brilliant storytelling. So, what did freedom mean to William Wallace? Not modern democracy, not civil rights, not the kind of freedom we imagine today. Freedom, for Wallace, meant self-rule. It meant Scotland making its own decisions, not being controlled by a foreign king. It meant dying on your feet, rather than living on your knees. And that's what he did. He lived by the sword, and he died by the sword. But he left behind a story so powerful, it outlived the empire that tried to erase him. The real William Wallace wasn't a movie hero. He was a flawed, driven, brilliant, and brutal man who rose from obscurity to challenge one of the most powerful kings in history. He fought for something bigger than himself. He lost. And yet, in the end, he won. Because centuries later, we still say his name. And, as quoted at the end of Braveheart,
"In the year of our Lord 1314, patriots of Scotland, starving and outnumbered, charged the fields of Bannockburn. They fought like warrior poets. They fought like Scotsmen and won their freedom."
Chapter 3. Julius Caesar.
The Romans were outnumbered at least 4-1. Trapped between two armies, surrounded by thousands of hostile warriors, and running out of food fast. By all logic, they should have been slaughtered. But one man didn't believe in logic. He believed in power, strategy, and himself. His name? Julius Caesar. And what happened next at the Battle of Alesia would change the course of world history forever. This isn't just the story of a battle. It's the story of ambition, betrayal, desperation, and genius. A brutal showdown between Rome's greatest general and a desperate Gallic rebellion led by a warrior king. It's one of the most incredible sieges in ancient military history. And it marked the moment when Julius Caesar stopped being a politician and started becoming a legend. Few figures in history command as much recognition as Gaius Julius Caesar, the man whose name would become synonymous with power itself. To the Romans of his time, he was more than just a general. He was a visionary leader, a political mastermind, and a soldier of unshakable resolve. His military genius saw him outwit, outmaneuver, and outfight enemies across Europe, most famously in his conquest of Gaul, where he turned the disciplined legions of Rome into an unstoppable war machine. Yet Caesar's ambition reached beyond the battlefield. With every victory, his influence over the Senate and the people of Rome grew, setting him on a collision course with the old Republican order. His rise was not merely the ascent of a man, but the transformation of Rome itself, from a republic ruled by tradition to an empire forged under the will of one extraordinary leader and arguably the most famous Roman who ever lived. The story of Gaius Julius Caesar begins in the sweltering summer of 100 BC, in the heart of Rome. He was born into the ancient patrician family of the gens Julia, a lineage that claimed divine descent from Aeolus, the supposed son of the Trojan hero Aeneas, and thus, if one followed the myths, from the goddess Venus herself. This connection was more than an ornamental boast. In Rome, ancestry carried political weight, and the Julii were among the oldest patrician houses. Yet by the 1st century BC, their influence had faded. Noble blood did not automatically mean wealth or political power, and Caesar's branch of the family was neither especially rich nor dominant in the Senate. Caesar's father, also named Gaius Julius Caesar, served as a praetor, a senior judicial official, and governed the province of Asia before dying suddenly when Caesar was only 16. His mother, Aurelia Cotta, came from a politically influential plebeian family known for their strong moral standing and keen involvement in public life. Aurelia's intelligence, discipline, and social connections would shape much of Caesar's early upbringing. Roman writers later credited her as one of the key figures behind his ambition and poise. From his earliest years, Caesar lived in a city caught between tradition and transformation. The Roman Republic was growing into a Mediterranean superpower, yet internal divisions between optimates, the conservative senatorial elite, and populares leaders seeking reforms for the common people, were already threatening its stability. Caesar's youth coincided with the rise and fall of powerful figures like Gaius, Marius, and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, whose rivalry would erupt into civil war. Caesar's family was linked by marriage to Marius, a towering figure in Roman politics who had reformed the legions and dominated elections. This connection would prove dangerous when Sulla seized power in 82 BC and initiated bloody proscriptions against Marius's supporters. Caesar, barely 18, had already married Cornelia, the daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, one of Marius's allies. Sulla ordered Caesar to divorce her. He refused. This was not a symbolic act of teenage rebellion. Defying Sulla was tantamount to courting death. The dictator confiscated much of Caesar's inheritance, stripped him of his priesthood as Flamen Dialis, and placed him under threat of execution. It was only through the intercession of powerful friends, and perhaps Sulla's own grudging respect for the young man's resolve, that Caesar's life was spared. Sulla is said to have remarked to his associates,
"You will find many Mariuses in this boy."
Forced into exile, Caesar joined the Roman military in Asia Minor, serving under Marcus Minucius Thermus. In one of his earliest exploits, he displayed remarkable courage during the siege of Mytilene. He also earned the civic crown, a rare honor awarded for saving the life of a fellow Roman soldier in battle. After Thermus sent him on a diplomatic mission to the court of King Nicomedes IV of Bithynia, Rumors swirled in Rome about the nature of Caesar's relationship with the king, a whisper that would follow him for decades, weaponized by his enemies in political propaganda. Upon Sulla's death in 78 BC, Caesar returned to Rome and began his legal career. He quickly gained a reputation for eloquence, precision, and relentless preparation, often prosecuting corrupt provincial governors. Yet he was ambitious for more than courtroom victories. His oratory was not just a legal tool, it was a weapon of politics, a way to rally allies and charm the Roman public. In the years that followed, Caesar refined his political skills, carefully cultivating the image of a man aligned with the populares' cause. He also began building a network of loyal supporters, not just among senators, but among Rome's common citizens, who responded to his charisma and promises of reform. By the mid-60s BC, Caesar had climbed the cursus honorum, the traditional ladder of Roman political offices. He served as quaestor in Spain, then as aedile in Rome, staging lavish public games that won him immense popularity but also left him deeply in debt. It is here in Spain that he came across a statue of Alexander the Great. Caesar is said to have wept with envy. Before Alexander had died at the young age of 32, he had forged an empire and had conquered most of the known world. Caesar felt that he as yet had achieved nothing. With a hardened determination, he returned to Rome. Through his many bribes and his skill at negotiation and being granted favors, his hard work eventually paid off. His debts were not a sign of recklessness so much as a calculated gamble. In the Roman political system, extravagant generosity could be repaid in loyalty and votes. As the Greek historian Plutarch said,
He was so profuse in his expenses that before he had any public employment, he was hugely in debt. Many thought by incurring such expenses, he changed a solid good for what would prove a short and uncertain return. But in truth, he was purchasing what was of greatest value at an inconsiderable rate.
In 63 BC, at the age of 37, Caesar secured the prestigious position of Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of Rome, a role that brought both influence and visibility. The election was fiercely contested, and his victory shocked many, not least because he had borrowed vast sums to fund his campaign. When warned of the financial risk, Caesar is said to have replied,
"The die is cast,"
foreshadowing words he would make famous years later. This mixture of audacity, charm, and calculated risk-taking defined Caesar's early career. By the time he served as propraetor in Spain in 61 BC, defeating hostile tribes and restoring order, he had positioned himself as one of Rome's rising stars. His return to Rome in 59 BC set the stage for his most famous political alliance, the First Triumvirate, with Pompey the Great, Rome's most powerful general, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, Rome's richest man. He then became, at age 41, consul, one of Rome's two annual leaders. After intimidating the second Roman consul Bibulus to take a back seat, Caesar was left to rule alone. It was even joked that this was the consulship of Julius and Caesar. The first law that Caesar introduced was to give land to soldiers. The Roman Senate disagreed and attempted to block this, but Caesar used force to make them comply. Caesar understood that in the long run, the loyalty of the army was far more valuable than politicians. The pact made with Pompey and Crassus, and his appointment as consul, would ultimately propel Caesar toward the conquest of Gaul and the dramatic events at Alesia. By 60 BC, Caesar's political star was burning bright, but it was not yet secure. In the volatile arena of Roman politics, popularity was a fragile asset, and debts weighed heavily on his future. His solution was as bold as it was ambitious. Secure a provincial command that would give him both the opportunity for military glory and the wealth to pay off his creditors. The opportunity came in the form of an extraordinary political deal, the so-called First Triumvirate. This informal alliance bound together three of the most powerful men in Rome. Each man had something to gain. Pompey wanted land for his veterans and Senate ratification of his eastern settlements. Crassus sought favorable tax reforms for his allies in the equestrian order, and Caesar needed a secure command to enhance his prestige. When his year as consul ended, Caesar secured a 5-year proconsular command over Cisalpine Gaul, northern Italy, Transalpine Gaul, southern France, and Illyricum, western Balkans. Later, extended to 10 years, this appointment placed him at the frontier of Rome's world, an unstable, fertile ground for conquest. Gaul in 58 BC was a mosaic of tribal societies. The warlike Helvetii in the east, the Belgic tribes in the north, and the culturally sophisticated but politically fractured peoples of central and western Gaul. These tribes were far from a unified nation. Ancient rivalries, shifting alliances, and competition for trade and territory kept them divided. Yet they shared a fierce independence and a deep mistrust of Roman encroachment. Caesar's first major challenge came almost immediately. The Helvetii, a large confederation of tribes from what is now Switzerland, planned a mass migration westward into the lands of the Santones, near the Atlantic coast. Their movement threatened to destabilize the region, and Roman allies in Gaul appealed to Caesar for help. Caesar acted swiftly. Marching north from Cisalpine Gaul, he blocked the Helvetii's intended route along the Rhone River by fortifying the opposite bank and destroying a bridge. When they attempted to negotiate passage, Caesar stalled them until reinforcements arrived. Realizing their path was blocked, the Helvetii took a more difficult northern route through the territory of the Sequani and Aedui, both of whom requested Roman assistance against the migrants. In the ensuing campaign, Caesar pursued the Helvetii relentlessly, cutting off their supplies and forcing a decisive battle at Bibracte. Despite being heavily outnumbered, his disciplined legions, veterans hardened by rigorous training, routed the Helvetii. Of his battle against the Helvetii, he wrote,
Caesar, first of all, had his own horse taken out of the way, and then the horses of other officers. Caesar wanted the danger to be the same for everyone, and for no one to have the hope of escape. Then Caesar spoke a few words of encouragement to the men. Hailing their javelins from above, our men easily broke up the enemy's mass formation, and having achieved this, drew their swords and charged. In the end, the wounds and the toil of battle were too much for the Helvetii, and they began to retire to a hill about a mile away.
Caesar's victory not only secured Rome's position in central Gaul, but also sent a clear message to other tribes. The Roman general was not to be underestimated. No sooner had the Helvetian threat been neutralized than a new danger emerged from across the Rhine, the Suebi, a powerful Germanic tribe under the warlord Ariovistus. Invited into Gaul by certain tribes as mercenaries, the Suebi soon became conquerors, seizing land and exacting tribute. Caesar saw their presence as a strategic threat, not only to Gaul but to Roman control over the Rhine frontier. In a series of tense diplomatic exchanges, Ariovistus refused Caesar's demands to withdraw and even mocked the general for venturing so far from Rome. The standoff ended in open battle near the Vosges Mountains, where Caesar's legions broke the German line and drove Ariovistus back across the Rhine. This victory enhanced Caesar's reputation as a defender of Rome against barbarian incursions, a theme he would emphasize in his own Commentarii de Bello Gallico. By the end of his first year in Gaul, Caesar had transformed his position from a political exile in waiting into Rome's most celebrated commander. His campaigns brought him immense wealth through spoils and tribute, much of which he used to pay debts and fund political operations back in Rome. His relationship with his legions deepened. He shared their hardships, rewarded their loyalty, and inspired them with the belief that they were shaping the destiny of Rome.
Caesar was the most skillful swordsman and horseman, and showed surprising powers of endurance. He always led his army more often on foot than in the saddle, went bareheaded in the sun and the rain alike, and could travel for long distances at incredible speed, taking very little luggage. If he reached an unfordable river, he'd either swim or propel himself across on an inflated skin, and often arrived at his destination before the messengers that he'd sent ahead to announce his approach.
But Caesar was not merely defending Roman allies, he was shaping events to justify further expansion. Each campaign created new alliances and new pretexts for intervention, drawing Rome deeper into the affairs of Gaul. By the late 50s BC, his ambitions extended beyond securing the frontier. He envisioned nothing less than the full subjugation of Gaul, a project that would reach its dramatic climax at Alesia. By 53 BC, Caesar's conquests in Gaul had made him the most famous man in Rome, though not universally admired. His victories over the Helvetii, the Belgae, and the Germanic Suebi were celebrated in the Forum, but his growing power alarmed the Senate's conservative faction, the Optimates. Many feared that Caesar was becoming another Sulla, a general who could march on Rome and rule by force. Yet Gaul was not fully subdued. While many tribes had submitted to Rome, often under duress, resentment simmered beneath the surface. The burden of Roman demands, tribute, hostages, and military service strained traditional tribal structures. Worse still, the Romans interfered in internal disputes, backing certain leaders over others and imposing their will on political succession. For the Gauls, this was not simply foreign policy, it was an assault on their freedom and way of life. The Gallic world was ethnically and culturally diverse, but shared certain traits: warrior aristocracies, councils of elders, and a deep reverence for the Druids, who held religious and judicial authority. Caesar had learned to exploit divisions between tribes, forging alliances with some while crushing others. His divide et impera, divide and rule, tactics had worked for years, but such strategies carry inherent risk. Sooner or later, someone might emerge who could unite the tribes against him. The late 50s BC brought an added complication: instability in Rome. The first triumvirate was fracturing. Crassus, seeking military glory to match Caesar and Pompey, embarked on a campaign against the Parthians. In 53 BC, at Carrhae, his army was annihilated and he was killed. Legend says that Crassus was captured and was executed by being fed molten gold. However, that is a story for another time. With Crassus gone, the delicate balance between Caesar and Pompey began to unravel, and Caesar could not afford a serious crisis in Gaul that might weaken his position in Roman politics. The spark came in the winter of 53-52 BC, when the Carnutes, a central Gallic tribe, attacked the Roman-held town of Cenabum, modern Orleans, killing Roman traders and a garrison detachment. This was no random act of violence, it was a call to arms. Word spread quickly, and in the Arvernian lands of central Gaul, a young noble named Vercingetorix emerged as the leader who would answer that call. Vercingetorix was the son of an Arvernian noble executed years earlier for attempting to make himself king. He had grown up during the years of Roman expansion and understood both Roman strengths and Gallic weaknesses. By Roman accounts, he was charismatic, a gifted orator, and an exceptional cavalry commander. By Gallic tradition, he was a dux bellorum, a war leader chosen in time of crisis. In early 52 BC, Vercingetorix rallied the Arverni to his banner, promising to restore Gallic independence. He reached out to other tribes, calling for a united front against Rome. His strategy was unconventional. Rather than meeting the legions in open battle, he proposed a scorched earth policy, destroying crops, burning villages, and denying Caesar's armies the supplies they needed to operate in hostile territory. This was a direct challenge to the Roman method of warfare, which relied heavily on foraging and local requisitioning. Vercingetorix said to his men,
"We must strive by every means to prevent the Romans from obtaining forage and supplies. This will be easy, since we are strong in cavalry and the season is in our favor. Along the enemy's line of march, we must burn all the villages and farms within the radius that their forages can cover. The Romans will either succumb to starvation or have to expose themselves to serious risk by going far from their camp."
The plan worked in part. As Caesar moved through central Gaul, he found the land stripped bare. Vercingetorix's cavalry harassed his columns, ambushing foraging parties and cutting off smaller detachments. The Gauls avoided pitched battles unless the ground and numbers favored them. But ultimately, both armies knew that this conflict would have to be concluded in open battle. The first major test came at Gergovia, the Arvernian stronghold in the massive Central. Perched on a plateau with steep slopes, Gergovia was a fortress in itself. Caesar, under pressure to bring the campaign to a quick conclusion, attempted to take the city by assault. The attack ended in failure, one of the rare, clear defeats in Caesar's career. Roman casualties numbered in the thousands, and Caesar was forced to withdraw. The victory at Gergovia emboldened the Gallic resistance. More tribes joined Vercingetorix, including some who had previously sided with Caesar. The Roman general now faced a coalition of unprecedented size, with its morale boosted by the knowledge that Caesar could be beaten. Despite the setback, Caesar was far from finished. He relied on the discipline and loyalty of his legions, as well as his own mastery of rapid, unexpected movements. In a daring maneuver, he crossed the Loire River under challenging conditions and struck at the supply lines of his enemies. The two leaders, Caesar and Vercingetorix, were now locked in a strategic duel, each trying to force the other into a disadvantageous position. This cat-and-mouse game would come to its climax at a place called Alesia, a hilltop settlement in the territory of the Mandubii. There, Vercingetorix would make his stand, and Caesar would attempt one of the most audacious sieges in ancient history. The year was 52 BC, and the Gallic revolt had reached its height. After the failed Roman assault at Gergovia, Vercingetorix withdrew to regroup, his cavalry shadowing Caesar's every move. The Gallic leader, confident in the defensive advantage of strongholds, selected the fortified settlement of Alesia for his next stand. Alesia was no ordinary hill fort. Situated on a plateau in the territory of the Mandubii, it was surrounded on all sides by steep slopes and enclosed by walls. At its base lay two rivers, the Oze and the Ozerain, and beyond them open plains, ideal terrain for cavalry. To an ancient commander, Alesia looked almost impregnable. From within its walls, Vercingetorix could hold out for months, relying on a massive relief force from allied tribes to break the siege. This was the heart of his strategy. Lure Caesar into committing to a costly, time-consuming siege, while summoning the full military strength of Gaul to crush the Romans from both inside and out. Most generals in Caesar's position would have bypassed Alesia, unwilling to commit resources to a fortress defended by tens of thousands of warriors. But Caesar understood two things. First, that Alesia was the symbolic heart of the Gallic resistance. If he broke it, the war would end. And second, that Vercingetorix's decision to concentrate his forces inside the settlement created an opportunity to trap them. So Caesar made a bold choice. He would not merely blockade Alesia, he would encircle it entirely, cutting off all escape and all supply. And then he would prepare to fight not one enemy force, but two, the garrison within and the relief army without. The Roman army was not just a war machine, It was a construction corps without equal in the ancient world. It was the Roman legion that made them so formidable. It was an organized and highly sophisticated type of warfare. This kind of military system would not be rivaled until Napoleon's army corps method many centuries later. A Roman legion almost acted like a miniature army, made up of anywhere from 7,000 to 10,000 men with its own infantry, cavalry, and artillery. Under Caesar's orders, the legions began to build a circumvallation, a continuous line of fortifications facing inward toward Alesia. Over 11 miles, 18 kilometers, of ditch, rampart, and wooden palisade encircled the hill fort. The fortifications were formidable. 2 deep ditches in front, one filled with water from the rivers. Behind them, an earth rampart nearly 12 feet, 4 meters high, topped with a wooden palisade. At regular intervals, watchtowers allowed archers and artillery crews to rain arrows and javelins on attackers. In front of the ditches, Caesar placed rows of cippi, sharpened stakes hidden in pits, and lilies, cone-shaped holes with stakes at the bottom, designed to break charges, resist cavalry, and maim the enemy. But Caesar knew the relief army was coming, and that it would vastly outnumber his own force. So he did something even more extraordinary. He ordered the construction of a second line of fortifications, the contravallation, 14 miles, 22 kilometers long, facing outward to defend against attacks from the outside. In effect, the Romans built 2 complete siege lines, back to back, one to keep the defenders in and one to keep the rescuers out. Between them lay Caesar's army, a thin but disciplined ring of steel and timber. At best, these fortifications would be unbreakable. At worst, they would have delayed any enemy attacks long enough for Caesar to send reinforcements to repel them. A Roman general named Corbulo once said,
"More campaigns are won by the dolabra than by the sword."
A dolabra was a Roman trenching tool, used to dig out soil and acted as both an axe and pickaxe. This, in the end, was a symbol which showed the ultimate determination of the Romans, that they would not give up, and more often than not, many sieges were won before they had even begun for this very reason. For the defenders in Alesia, the siege was brutal from the start. Vercingetorix had not brought enough food to feed both his warriors and the civilian population. As the weeks dragged on, rations grew scarce. In a desperate attempt to conserve supplies, the Gallic leader expelled the non-combatants, women, children, and the elderly, from the town, hoping the Romans would let them pass. Caesar refused. Allowing them through would waste precious resources, and releasing them would let them carry intelligence to the relief force. Trapped between the Roman and Gallic lines, these civilians, thousands of them, slowly died of hunger and exposure. Ancient warfare had no mercy for the innocent. Meanwhile, the Romans faced their own hardships. They were deep in hostile territory, reliant on their fortifications for survival. Constant skirmishes tested their vigilance. The men labored day and night, repairing walls, digging ditches, and maintaining watch. Morale was a delicate balance, sustained by discipline, Caesar's presence, and the knowledge that their survival depended on their engineering. In September, the Gallic relief army arrived, and it was vast. Ancient sources, likely exaggerating, claimed 250,000 warriors from almost every Gallic tribe. Even if the real number was closer to 80,000 to 100,000, it was still far more than Caesar's force of about 50,000. The Gallic plan was straightforward: launch simultaneous attacks from both inside and outside the Roman lines to overwhelm the besiegers. The relief army assaulted the contravallation, while Vercingetorix's forces attacked the circumvallation from within. The first assaults were repelled, but over the next days the pressure mounted. the Gauls launched coordinated attacks at weak points, and on one occasion nearly broke through. Caesar, moving rapidly on horseback from sector to sector, personally oversaw counterattacks, rallying his men where the danger was greatest. In the words of Caesar,
"It was too dark to see, and casualties were heavy on both sides." The generals, who had been detailed for the defense of this particular sector, reinforced the points where they knew the troops were hard-pressed, with men brought up from well behind the fighting line.
hundreds of Gaul warriors ended up impaled on spikes and stakes, while also being mowed down by javelin and arrow fire from the high ramparts. The decisive moment came when the relief army concentrated its forces on a low section of the outer line near the river. Simultaneously, Vercingetorix hurled his best warriors against the inner walls. For hours the Romans fought for their lives, their lines bending but not breaking. During the battle, Caesar moved from his command post down to all parts of the fighting line. He encouraged his troops and reminded them that all they had fought for depended on today's battle. He also fought himself, fighting alongside his men and showing them that they would face the danger together. He demonstrated that he was always willing to go where he was needed, even where the fighting was at its thickest. His key input as a military commander was that of inspiration, demonstrating to his men that he would fight alongside them and fill his troops with newfound vigor. And all this was despite that he was nearing 50 years old at this point, which in these times was considered as nearing your twilight years. Caesar committed his reserves, a mix of Germanic cavalry allies and veteran legionaries, in a massive counterattack. The cavalry swept around the enemy flank, striking the relief army from behind. Panic spread among the Gauls outside, and their retreat quickly became a rout. A retreating army is extremely vulnerable, and many Gauls were killed whilst fleeing. Luckily for many of Gauls, the approaching darkness saved them. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix's forces, seeing the relief army destroyed, abandoned the assault and withdrew to the safety of the town. With no hope of rescue and supplies exhausted, Vercingetorix called a council. He offered himself to Caesar, either to be executed or paraded in Rome as a prisoner. The next day, the gates of Alesia opened, and Vercingetorix, fully armed, mounted, and still regal in bearing, rode out to meet his conqueror. Before the assembled legions, he dismounted, removed his weapons, and sat in silence at Caesar's feet. The siege of Alesia was over. Caesar had achieved what many would say was the impossible. He had held 2 huge lines of trench defenses and had beaten 2 armies, and was outnumbered at least 5 to 1. The siege of Alesia in 52 BC was not merely the end of a military campaign. It was the decisive moment that shaped the destiny of Gaul and accelerated the collapse of the Roman Republic. The days following the surrender were marked by a careful orchestration of power, punishment, and propaganda. After the surrender, Caesar faced a crucial political decision: how to deal with the tens of thousands of Gallic warriors who had fought against him. His solution was characteristic of his leadership style: pragmatic, selective in mercy, and designed to send a message. Many of the rank-and-file Gallic warriors were spared. Caesar distributed them among his legions as slaves or released them to their homes, often after extracting oaths of loyalty. Tribal chiefs and key commanders were either executed or taken as hostages to ensure the compliance of their tribes. Those civilians who survived the siege, now starving, broken, and leaderless, were left to witness the dismantling of their independence. By not wiping out the entire Gallic population, Caesar avoided a cycle of annihilation and resistance. Instead, he dismantled the political and military structures that had made large-scale resistance possible, ensuring Roman dominance in the years to come. Vercingetorix's surrender was a calculated act of political theater. Ancient sources differ in their accounts, but the consensus is that Caesar spared him initially, intending to display him in his triumph in Rome. For 6 years, Vercingetorix remained a prisoner, most likely in the Tullianum, the Roman state prison. In 46 BC, Caesar held his triumph, the lavish public parade celebrating his victories. Vercingetorix was brought forth in chains, paraded through the streets as the symbol of Caesar's conquest. At the conclusion of the triumph, as Roman custom dictated, he was ritually strangled. His death marked the symbolic end of Gallic independence. Following Alesia, Gaul was not entirely pacified. Small uprisings flared in the following years, but they lacked the coordination and scale of Vercingetorix's revolt. Caesar spent the winter of 51 to 50 BC systematically subduing remaining pockets of resistance. Roman administration began to take hold. Fortified Roman towns, oppida, became centers of trade and governance. Roman roads and infrastructure facilitated troop movement, commerce, and cultural assimilation. Latin began to spread, alongside Roman law, taxation, and urban planning. Over time, Gaul transformed from a patchwork of tribal confederations into one of the most Romanized provinces in the empire. Caesar was not content to let the significance of Alesia speak for itself. He shaped the narrative. In Book 7 of his Commentarii de Bello Gallico, he described the siege in meticulous detail, presenting himself as a master strategist, a bringer of order, and a commander whose mercy was as notable as his ruthlessness. While the commentaries are invaluable historical sources, they were also political tools. Caesar was embroiled in an escalating rivalry with Pompey and the senatorial elite in Rome. By publicizing his achievements in Gaul, he justified his extended command beyond the usual term, portrayed himself as Rome's greatest living general, outshining rivals, built popular support among the masses and the army, both of whom would later play critical roles in his seizure of power. Many centuries later, French emperor and one of the greatest military commanders in history, Napoleon Bonaparte, took Caesar's commentaries out on campaign. From a purely military standpoint, the Siege of Alesia was a masterpiece of engineering, logistics, and psychological warfare. Historians have called it one of the most impressive examples of double encirclement, circumvallation, and contravallation in recorded history. Caesar's ability to command simultaneous operations against internal and external enemies demonstrated operational flexibility, shifting reserves rapidly to where they were most needed. Engineering innovation, integrating passive defenses, traps, ditches, ramparts, with active combat responses, and psychological pressure, starving the enemy while displaying readiness for battle. The battle also underscored Caesar's willingness to take calculated risks. Encircling Alesia placed his army in a precarious position, surrounded by hostile forces, far from secure supply lines. Failure would have been catastrophic, both militarily and politically, and Rome would have lost both general and governor. News of Alesia's victory electrified Rome. The Senate, even those hostile to Caesar, could not ignore the scale of his achievement. Statues were erected, festivals held, and his popularity among the populares, the political faction favoring the common people, soared. But for the optimates, the senatorial aristocracy, Caesar's growing power was cause for alarm. They saw in Alesia not just the end of Gallic resistance, but the emergence of a man whose influence might rival or overthrow the Republic itself. Within 2 years, the tensions between Caesar and the Senate would erupt into open civil war. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC, he did so as the undefeated conqueror of Gaul, a man whose legions were loyal to him personally, forged in campaigns like Alesia. The consequences of Alesia extended far beyond the lifetime of Caesar. For Gaul, Romanization brought roads, cities, and economic integration, but also the loss of political autonomy and cultural independence. For Rome, the wealth and manpower of Gaul became a cornerstone of the Roman Empire for centuries. And for Caesar, Alesia solidified his legend. providing the political capital he would use to seize ultimate power. In military history, Alesia remains a case study in siegecraft, strategic patience, and the effective use of fortifications. It stands as one of the defining moments of antiquity, the victory that ended an era of Gallic independence and set the stage for the final collapse of the Roman Republic. The story of Julius Caesar does not end at Alesia. That battle was not his final triumph, nor the end of his political journey. It was the fulcrum on which the future of Rome shifted. To understand his place in history, we must trace the line from his early ambitions, through his rise as the master of Gaul, to his transformation into a figure who would overturn the very foundations of the Roman Republic. After Alesia, Caesar spent another year consolidating Roman control in Gaul. By 50 BC, the province was firmly under his command, and its resources, wealth, soldiers, and prestige were his to wield. But his position in Rome was becoming increasingly precarious. The political alliance known as the First Triumvirate, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, had already fractured. Crassus had died in 53 BC at Carrhae, his ambitions undone by a disastrous campaign against the Parthians. Pompey, once Caesar's ally and even his son-in-law, had drifted toward the conservative Optimates faction in the Senate, aligning himself with Caesar's political enemies. The Senate, alarmed by Caesar's rising influence, demanded he relinquish his military command and return to Rome as a private citizen. This would have left him vulnerable to prosecution and likely exile for alleged abuses of power during his consulship and his Gallic campaigns. Caesar's choice was stark: obey and face political ruin, or defy the Senate and risk civil war. In the 4th of January 9 BC, he chose the latter. Crossing the Rubicon River with his legion, an act forbidden under Roman law, he famously declared,
Alea iacta est. The die is cast.
Civil war erupted. The war between Caesar and Pompey spanned several theaters: Italy, Greece, Egypt, Africa, and Spain. Caesar's victories at Pharsalus 48 BC, Thapsus 46 BC, and Munda 45 BC confirmed his dominance. Pompey was killed in Egypt, and Caesar's involvement there led to his celebrated and politically controversial liaison with Cleopatra VII, the Queen of Egypt. By 45 BC, Caesar was the unchallenged ruler of Rome. The Senate, stripped of much of its authority, named him Dictator Perpetuo, Dictator in perpetuity. This was basically king in all but name. Yet his reforms were not merely about consolidating personal power. Caesar implemented calendar reform, the introduction of the Julian calendar, a solar-based system that endured, with modifications, into modern times. Debt relief, laws to ease the financial strain on Rome's poor. Provincial integration, extending citizenship rights and senatorial representation to provincials, especially in Gaul and Spain. And administrative streamlining, reorganizing local governments, reducing corruption, and increasing efficiency. These measures, while beneficial to Rome's stability, threatened the entrenched power of the aristocracy. For the Optimates, Caesar's consolidation of power looked like the death knell of the Republic. His dictatorship and hints that he might aspire to kingship were intolerable to men who prided themselves on the traditions of Roman liberty, however oligarchic those traditions actually were. By early 44 BC, Julius Caesar was a man whose shadow stretched over every corner of the Roman world. He had marched his legions farther than any Roman general before him, subduing Gaul in nearly a decade of relentless campaigning, then turned his sword against Pompey the Great and the senatorial elite who had sought to strip him of his power. This was no mere honorific. In the Roman mind, dictatorship was meant to be a temporary office, a tool for moments of extreme crisis. A dictator was to serve for 6 months at most, to stabilize the state and then relinquish power. Caesar's perpetual dictatorship broke with that tradition. To his allies, it was a sign of his unmatched leadership. To his enemies, it was an omen of tyranny. The Romans had long despised the very idea of monarchy. Centuries earlier, they had expelled their last king, Tarquin the Proud, and sworn that never again would one man rule Rome as a monarch. The Republic had been built on that rejection. The Senate, the assemblies, the complex checks and balances of Roman law all existed to prevent the rise of another king. And yet, in Caesar's sweeping reforms, many saw a monarch in all but name. He controlled legislation, finance, appointments, the army. He even had his image minted on coins while still alive, a divine honor usually reserved for gods or deified leaders after death. Statues of Caesar rose across Rome, priests were appointed to serve his cult, and seats in the theater were reserved for him alone. The tipping point came during the festival of Lupercalia in February 44 BC. As crowds filled the streets, Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general, attempted a theatrical gesture. Before the people, he offered Caesar a royal diadem, a crown. Caesar, according to Plutarch, pushed it aside to a roar of applause. Antony tried again, but Caesar refused once more, declaring that only Jupiter was king of Rome. To the people, it was a dramatic rejection of monarchy. To the Senate, however, it was proof that the idea had been floated at all. Rumors spread that Caesar secretly desired the crown, that he only refused it because the moment wasn't right. Among the Senate were men of deep resentment. Some had lost power and privilege under Caesar's rise. Others truly believed they were defending the Republic. Leading them were Gaius Cassius Longinus, a sharp and bitter senator who had fought against Caesar in the Civil War, and Marcus Junius Brutus, a man whose name carried the weight of history. Brutus was said to be descended from Lucius Junius Brutus, the very man who had expelled the last king of Rome centuries before. For the conspirators, Brutus was not just a man, he was a symbol, living proof that the Republic could yet be saved. The conspiracy swelled to more than 60 senators. They met in secret, swearing oaths of silence, sharpening daggers, and planning their strike. Their timing was deliberate. Caesar was scheduled to attend a session of the Senate at the Theatre of Pompey on the 15th of March, the Ides. There, surrounded only by senators and without the protection of his loyal legions, he would be vulnerable. Ancient writers revel in describing the strange omens that preceded Caesar's death. Suetonius records that on the eve of the Ides, Caesar's horses refused to graze and wept openly. A bird was said to have dropped a sprig of laurel, Caesar's sacred symbol of victory, into the chamber of Pompey's statue where the assassination would occur. Most famous of all were the dreams of Calpurnia, Caesar's wife. Plutarch tells us she awoke in terror, having seen her husband's body pierced with wounds in her arms. She begged him not to go to the Senate that day, insisting the signs were too dire. Caesar hesitated. He had ignored omens before, but this time he considered postponing his appearance. Rumors spread of plots to murder Caesar. He knew that his life was under threat, but he declined a bodyguard. He stated,
It is better to die once than to always live in fear of death.
Yet fate or pride intervened. Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators, and a man Caesar trusted deeply, came to his house. Playing on Caesar's sense of honor, he mocked the idea of surrendering to superstition. Would Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, bow before dreams? Would he insult the Senate by refusing to appear? Stung by the taunt, Caesar set aside Calpurnia's pleas. He dressed in his senator's toga, draped with a purple sash, and made his way to the theater of Pompey. Inside the Senate chamber, the conspirators were ready. They had concealed daggers beneath their togas. When Caesar entered, the senators rose in respect. He took his seat, unaware of the storm about to break. The signal came when Tullius Cimber approached, thrusting a petition into Caesar's hand, a plea to pardon his exiled brother. Caesar waved him off. Cimber grabbed Caesar's toga and yanked it down from his shoulders.
Why, this is violence.
Caesar cried. Casca struck first, slashing at Caesar's neck. Startled, Caesar turned and seized Casca's arm, crying,
Villain, what are you doing?
But more daggers flashed. Cassius lunged, Brutus advanced, and soon the air was filled with the frenzy of steel. Plutarch tells us Caesar was stabbed 23 times. At first he fought back, shielding himself with his arms, but as the wounds mounted, his strength failed. Then came Brutus. Ancient sources disagree on Caesar's last words. Some say he said nothing, pulling his toga over his head in silence. Others say he looked upon Brutus and whispered, in Greek,
Kesu, Teknon. You too, my child?
And then there is the famous line immortalized by Shakespeare,
E tu, Brute?
meaning,
You too, Brutus?
the final blow fell, and Caesar collapsed at the base of Pompey's statue. The irony was bitter. Caesar lay dead at the feet of the man he had once called ally, then rival, then defeated enemy. The chamber descended into chaos. Blood pooled on the floor as Caesar's body lay lifeless, his toga soaked in red. The senators, trembling, fled into the streets shouting,
Liberty! Liberty! The Republic is saved!
But outside, the reaction was far from jubilant. The people of Rome were stunned. Many had adored Caesar as a hero, the general who had enriched them with land and spoils, the leader who had thrown lavish games and feasts. To them, the senators were not liberators but murderers. The conspirators, expecting to be hailed as saviors, instead found themselves despised and hunted. At Caesar's funeral, Mark Antony seized the moment. Standing over the body, he read Caesar's will, which left money and land to the Roman people. Then, in a dramatic gesture, he lifted Caesar's blood-stained toga, displaying the rents and holes where the daggers had struck. The crowd erupted in fury. Riots engulfed the city. The homes of the assassins were attacked, and the Senate itself was forced into chaos. The conspirators had thought the death of Caesar would restore the Republic. Instead, it marked its end. The power vacuum left by his assassination plunged Rome into another series of brutal civil wars. Out of that chaos rose Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son, Octavian, soon to be Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Thus, the daggers of March did not save the Republic. They destroyed it. Caesar's ambition, his brilliance, his downfall, and his death would forever be remembered as the turning point when Rome ceased to be a republic of senators and became an empire of emperors. Julius Caesar occupies a complex place in history, celebrated as a military genius, a great commander, condemned as a destroyer of republican government, and admired for his vision of a more integrated empire. In the end, he left an immortal legacy, including military, political, to cultural influence. Caesar's campaigns in Gaul expanded Roman territory to the Atlantic Ocean and brought unprecedented wealth into the Republic. His tactical innovations, particularly at Alesia, remain a model of siege warfare, studied in military academies today. His writings, Commentarii de Bello Gallico, combine political propaganda with military memoir, influencing both historiography and political communication. Caesar's reforms modernized aspects of Roman governance, setting precedents for imperial administration. His expansion of citizenship and representation laid the groundwork for the multicultural Roman Empire. His accumulation of power weakened the Senate's authority irreversibly. The very name Caesar became synonymous with ruler, evolving into the titles Kaiser in German and Tsar in Russian. Even future Roman emperors adopted the title of Caesar, maybe in hope that the man's greatness would somehow be reflected on them. His life inspired countless works of literature, art, and political theory, from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar to modern political analyses of leadership and populism. But he was a man who seized every opportunity, who matched ambition with ability, and who shaped events rather than letting them shape him. His legacy is one of paradox, a liberator to some, a tyrant to others, a visionary reformer, and a destroyer of ancient freedoms. A man whose life's work ended in betrayal, yet whose name endures as a symbol of power. Julius Caesar's story is the tale of Rome itself. Ambitious, ruthless, innovative, and destined to change the world. To this day, Gaius Julius Caesar is not only remembered as a scheming politician, a great commander, and a power-hungry man with endless ambition, but also as the most famous Roman of all time.
Chapter 4. Napoleon Bonaparte.
Before Austerlitz, before Europe trembled at his name, Napoleon Bonaparte was just a boy from a small island in the Mediterranean. Napoleon is remembered today as one of the greatest military minds in history. He changed the way wars were fought. He created strategies and tactics that armies still study more than 200 years later. He dominated Europe like no man had since Julius Caesar. But even this towering figure had a beginning. Napoleon was born on August 15th, 1769, in Ajaccio, on the island of Corsica. Corsica had only recently become part of France, and the Bonaparte family were minor nobility. They were not wealthy, but they valued education and ambition. Napoleon's father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer and political figure. His mother, Letizia Ramolino, was strict and determined, instilling discipline and resilience in her children. From a young age, Napoleon showed a fierce intelligence. He loved history, especially stories of great generals. He dreamed not of farming or trade, but of armies, battles, and glory. Yet his early years were not easy. Corsica was poor and politically unstable. Napoleon struggled with the islanders' suspicion of outsiders, and he often felt isolated. He was small, awkward, and not physically strong in childhood. But his mind was sharp, and his ambition burned hotter than any hardship. At the age of 9, Napoleon left Corsica to study in mainland France. He enrolled in military schools, including the Brienne Military Academy, where he trained for a career as an officer. Life in France was difficult. He was often teased for his Corsican accent and modest background. He had to fight for respect among boys from wealthier families. But these challenges forged his resilience and determination. Napoleon excelled in mathematics and artillery studies. He became obsessed with military history, reading about Hannibal, Alexander the Great, and Caesar. These early studies shaped the strategies he would later use to defeat entire armies. Napoleon became a commissioned officer in the French army at the age of 16. France, at this time, was in turmoil. The revolution erupted in 1789, tearing apart the old order and creating opportunities for ambitious young officers. Napoleon saw a chance to rise quickly. He proved himself at every opportunity. He was daring, disciplined, and fearless, willing to take risks others would avoid. Napoleon's first major moment came during the siege of Toulon in 1793. Toulon, a southern French port, had revolted against the revolutionary government. Royalist forces invited the British Navy to occupy the city. The French Revolutionary Army was struggling to reclaim it. Napoleon, still a young artillery officer, saw the opportunity to make his mark. He proposed a bold plan: place artillery on the heights overlooking the city to bombard the harbor. His plan worked brilliantly. French forces retook the city, forcing the British to withdraw. Napoleon's success at Toulon earned him promotion to brigadier general at the age of 24. It was the first time Europe began to notice his skill. After Toulon, Napoleon quickly gained a reputation as a brilliant and unpredictable commander. He was known for daring moves, lightning-fast decisions, and the ability to see the battlefield in a way few others could. Some feared him. Some admired him. All recognized that he was destined for greatness. By the time he entered politics and eventually seized power in 1799, Napoleon had already established himself as a force to be reckoned with. Toulon was just the beginning. Every victory after it built the legend that would culminate at battles like Austerlitz. From the island of Corsica to the heights of Toulon, Napoleon's rise was rapid and relentless. He had learned to overcome obstacles, master strategy, and inspire soldiers. Napoleon's victories on the battlefield made him famous, but to rule France, he needed more than skill with armies. He needed power, influence, and timing. By the late 1790s, France was still a republic, but a troubled one. The revolution had overthrown kings, but political chaos remained. Factions fought for control. Corruption and economic instability weakened the government. Foreign enemies still threatened France's borders. Napoleon, already a celebrated general, was perfectly positioned. The people admired him, the army obeyed him, and the politicians feared him. In 1799, Napoleon seized power through a carefully planned coup. The government of the Directory was weak. Napoleon allied with key politicians and used the army to assert control. Within days, he replaced the old system with a new government, the consulate, making him first consul. From this position, Napoleon controlled France's army, treasury, and foreign policy. He became the most powerful man in the country. Napoleon did not stop at political control. He reformed laws, stabilized the economy, and strengthened the military. He created the Napoleonic Code, which standardized laws and ensured civil equality, though it also centralized authority. Through these actions, he gained support from the people and loyalty from the army. By 1804, Napoleon's influence was undeniable. He took the next step, crowning himself Emperor of the French. The ceremony in Paris was more than a ritual. It was a statement. Napoleon did not wait for the Pope to crown him. He placed the crown on his own head, signaling that his power came from himself, not the church or nobility. The message was clear. Napoleon was master of his destiny and the destiny of France. His coronation stunned Europe. Kings and emperors saw a new force rising. Allies and enemies alike realized that France now had a leader who combined military genius with political skill. Napoleon was no longer just a general. He was a ruler, a strategist, and a symbol of French power. Napoleon's victories were not only the result of his own genius, they were also the result of a completely new way of organizing armies. Before Napoleon, armies were massive, slow-moving, and rigid. Commands passed slowly, and units could not act independently. Napoleon changed all of that with his corps system. A corps was essentially a mini-army within the army. Each corps contained infantry, the main fighting force, trained to move and fight in coordination. Cavalry, fast-moving units used for reconnaissance, flanking attacks, or chasing retreating enemies. Artillery, cannons, and howitzers that could support attacks or defend positions. Support units, supply wagons, engineers, and medical personnel. Crucially, each corps was self-sufficient. It could fight independently if cut off from the rest of the army. It could march long distances without waiting for orders. It could respond to changing battlefield conditions faster than traditional armies. By dividing the army into corps, Napoleon created flexibility and speed. He could spread his forces across a wide front, then concentrate them where needed. This allowed him to deceive, outmaneuver, and overwhelm enemies. even when outnumbered. Napoleon combined his corps system into a single force, the Grande Armée. At its peak, the Grande Armée numbered over 200,000 men. It included soldiers from across France, both volunteers and conscripts. Each French region contributed men and resources. Peasants supplied the bulk of the infantry. Artisans and townspeople often joined artillery and engineers, bringing skills essential for building and maintaining equipment. The nobility and educated classes supplied officers and strategic planners, though merit often allowed talented men from humble backgrounds to rise quickly. Napoleon's army was not just a fighting force. It was a reflection of French society unified under a common purpose: defending the revolution and expanding French influence in Europe. The corps system and the Grande Armée gave Napoleon several key advantages. Speed and mobility. Corps could march separately and unite for battle, allowing the French army to move faster than enemies expected. Flexibility. Each corps could fight alone if necessary, making the army resilient to surprises or partial defeats. Surprise and concentration. Napoleon could feign weakness in one sector while concentrating forces in another, creating decisive advantages. Morale and loyalty. Soldiers trusted their commanders and the system, which encouraged initiative and confidence on the battlefield. Efficient supply. Because each corps carried its own supplies and artillery, the army could sustain itself over long campaigns without relying on slow logistics. With France united under his leadership, Napoleon turned his attention to Europe. The stage was set for his next challenge: defeating the combined armies of Austria and Russia at Austerlitz. By 1805, Europe would face the result of decades of preparation, ambition, and genius. And that brings us to the story of Austerlitz, where Napoleon would face his greatest test yet. The Battle of Austerlitz did not begin on the battlefield. It began months earlier, with a mistake Europe did not realize it was making. Napoleon Bonaparte did not win at Austerlitz because he had the biggest army. He did not win because his soldiers were stronger. He won because his enemies believed he was weak, and by the time they realized the truth, it was already too late. This is the story of how Napoleon Bonaparte destroyed two empires in a single day, and why Austerlitz became the most perfect battle ever fought. By the winter of 1805, Europe believed it finally understood Napoleon Bonaparte. He was dangerous, yes, but he was reckless, overconfident, too eager for glory. He had crowned himself emperor only a year earlier. He had humiliated Austria before. He had beaten Italy, Egypt, and half of Europe's armies. But now, many believed his luck was running out. Austria was ready for revenge. Russia was marching west with one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen. Britain was paying for the war and pushing everyone forward. Together, they believed they could crush Napoleon in a single, decisive blow. What they did not understand was that Napoleon had been waiting for this moment, and Austerlitz was the trap. In 1805, Napoleon faced a problem that would have broken most commanders. France was surrounded. Britain ruled the seas. Austria wanted revenge. Russia wanted influence in Europe. Prussia was watching closely, waiting to choose a side. This alliance became known as the Third Coalition. On paper, Napoleon was outmatched. The Russian army alone numbered over 100,000 men. The Austrians added tens of thousands more. They had experienced officers, noble generals, and the support of Europe's old powers. France, by comparison, was isolated. Napoleon's original plan had not even been to fight in Central Europe. He had been preparing to invade Britain. For years, Napoleon had built a massive army along the northern coast of France. It was called the Army of England. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers trained for one purpose: crossing the Channel. But Britain's navy made that impossible. And while Napoleon waited, Europe moved. Austria mobilized. Russia marched. The war came to Napoleon whether he wanted it or not. Now he had to do something almost impossible. He had to defeat two empires at the same time, deep inside Central Europe, before Prussia decided to join them. If he failed, his empire would collapse before it truly began. Napoleon's greatest weapon was not luck. It was preparation. When the Third Coalition formed, Napoleon did something no one expected. He turned his invasion army around. In a matter of weeks, the Grande Armée marched east. This was not a slow army. It was fast, disciplined, and flexible. Napoleon had spent years reshaping how armies worked. Instead of one massive force, his army was divided into corps. Each corps could fight on its own. Each had infantry, cavalry, and artillery. This meant Napoleon could spread his army out, move quickly, and then strike together when needed. It was modern warfare before the modern age. By the time Austria realized what was happening, it was already too late. Austria made the first move, and it was a disaster. An Austrian army under General Mack marched into Bavaria, expecting help from Russia. Napoleon moved faster. In a stunning campaign, French forces surrounded Mack at the town of Ulm. There was no great battle. There was no heroic last stand. The Austrian army simply collapsed. Over 30,000 men surrendered without a major fight. Europe was shocked. In a single stroke, Napoleon had removed Austria's main army from the war. But this victory created a new danger. Napoleon had advanced far into enemy territory. The Russian army was still coming, and Austria still had forces left. If Napoleon misjudged his next move, he could be trapped between larger armies. Napoleon pressed forward. In November 1805, French forces entered Vienna, the heart of the Austrian Empire. Once again, the city fell with little resistance. But Napoleon did not celebrate. Vienna meant nothing if the Russian army destroyed him next. The Russians, led by Tsar Alexander I, were young, confident, and eager for glory. With them was General Kutuzov, older, cautious, and deeply suspicious of Napoleon. Kutuzov wanted to avoid battle. Alexander wanted victory. This difference would matter more than anyone realized. Napoleon now faced a dangerous choice. He could retreat and wait, or he could do something far riskier. He chose risk. Napoleon understood something his enemies did not. They believed he wanted battle. They believed he was desperate. They believed his army was tired and stretched too far. So Napoleon encouraged those beliefs. He began pulling back. He abandoned strong positions. He allowed the Allies to move closer. To European commanders, this looked like weakness. To Napoleon, it was bait. Behind the scenes, he carefully positioned his corps. He studied the land. He measured the enemy's confidence. He wanted them to attack him, not because he had no choice, but because he knew exactly how they would do it. The area near the town of Austerlitz, in modern-day Czech Republic, looked harmless. Rolling hills, small villages, frozen ponds, gentle slopes. But one feature dominated everything: the Pratzen Heights. This elevated ground sat at the center of the battlefield. Any general would want it, and Napoleon gave it up. He deliberately left the heights lightly defended. To the Allies, this looked like proof. Napoleon was weak. His center was exposed. One strong push would split his army in half. They believed they had found the key to victory. They were wrong. The Allied army believed Napoleon's right flank was vulnerable. They planned to attack it with massive force. The idea was simple: crush Napoleon's right, cut him off from Vienna, force him to retreat or surrender. To do this, they would weaken their own center. Kutuzov was uneasy. He had seen Napoleon before. He sensed danger. But Tsar Alexander wanted action. So did the Austrian commanders. They believed they outnumbered Napoleon. They believed he was afraid. They believed the battle would be quick. Napoleon watched them prepare, and he smiled. By early December, both armies were in position. The night before the battle was cold and quiet. French soldiers lit campfires across the hills. Napoleon rode among them, speaking calmly, confidently. He told them the enemy had made a mistake. He told them victory was close. Meneval, a French soldier, stated,
In the night that preceded this memorable day, the Emperor visited the bivouac of his troops on foot. Suddenly the camp was illuminated by thousands of burning torches, which each bivouac raised aloft to salute the Emperor to celebrate the anniversary of his coronation. Napoleon, deeply touched by this improvised act of homage, expressed his regret at having on the morrow to fight a battle which would rob him of a large number of these good fellows, and added that he considered this the best evening of his life.
Across the field, the Allied army prepared to attack. They believed they would wake up to Napoleon's defeat. Neither side slept well, but only one side understood what was about to happen. The Allies believed Napoleon had exposed his weakness. In truth, he had exposed theirs. At Austerlitz, the battle would not be decided by numbers. It would be decided by timing, deception, and one sudden, crushing blow at the center of the battlefield. And when the sun rose on December 2nd, 1805, history was about to change forever. The morning of December 2nd, 1805, began in silence. A thick fog covered the low ground near Austerlitz. Visibility was poor. Sounds were muffled. Men could barely see more than a few dozen steps ahead. Napoleon noticed this immediately. The fog was not an obstacle. It was protection. As dawn approached, French troops stood quietly in their positions. They did not rush. They did not move forward. They waited. Across the field, the Allied army began to stir. This day was not chosen by chance. December 2nd was the one-year anniversary of Napoleon's coronation as Emperor of the French. His enemies believed fate was mocking him. Napoleon believed fate was offering him a gift. The Allied plan depended on speed. They intended to attack Napoleon's right flank before he could react. Columns of Russian and Austrian infantry began to move south through the fog. Their goal was to overwhelm the French forces near the villages of Telnitz and Sokolnitz. If successful, Napoleon's army would be cut off from its supply lines. To the Allied commanders, this was the moment everything came together. They believed Napoleon was cornered. What they did not see was how carefully Napoleon had positioned his troops. Napoleon's right flank was commanded by Marshal Davout. Davout was one of Napoleon's most reliable generals. His troops had marched long distances to reach the battlefield. They were tired. They were outnumbered. And Napoleon knew it. But Davout's orders were clear. Hold as long as possible. Do not break. Do not retreat too quickly. The right flank did not need to win. It only needed to survive. As the fog began to lift, fighting erupted near Telnitz. Allied troops pushed into the village. French defenders resisted fiercely, using buildings and narrow streets to slow the advance. The fighting was brutal and close. Houses changed hands multiple times. Men fired at point-blank range. Smoke filled the streets. The Allies kept pushing. They believed victory was near. Napoleon watched from a distance. He did not intervene. Further north, near Sokolnitz, the battle intensified. Allied forces attacked in waves. French troops fell back slowly, step by step. To outside observers, it looked like the French line was collapsing. Allied commanders sent more men forward. Each reinforcement weakened their center even further. Napoleon had expected this. From the Allied perspective, everything was going according to plan. Napoleon's right flank was under heavy pressure. French units were retreating. The road to Vienna seemed within reach. They believed Napoleon had miscalculated. They believed his army was spread too thin. What they did not realize was that Napoleon was watching the Pratzen Heights, and he saw exactly what he had been waiting for. As Allied troops moved south, The Pratzen Heights were left almost empty. Only light forces remained. The center of the Allied army was thinning rapidly. Napoleon turned to his generals. This was the moment, but he did not rush. He waited. He needed one thing. Napoleon needed the fog to lift. As long as the fog covered the heights, his attack would remain hidden. Time passed slowly. Cannons fired in the distance. Messengers rode back and forth. The sound of battle grew louder. Then, just as Napoleon hoped, the fog began to rise. Sunlight broke through the mist. The Pratzen Heights stood clear and exposed. Napoleon did not hesitate. He turned to Marshal Soult. His words were calm. "How long will it take you to seize the heights?" Soult answered, "Less than 20 minutes." Napoleon nodded. "Then go." French troops surged forward. Columns moved uphill toward the Pratzen Heights. This was not a chaotic charge. It was precise and controlled. The soldiers knew their role. They had trained for moments like this. As they emerged from the fog, they shocked the Allied forces. The Allies had not expected an attack from the center. They had believed it was weak. Now, it was coming alive. Allied commanders reacted too slowly. Orders were unclear. Messages contradicted each other. Some units continued attacking the French right, unaware of what was happening behind them. Others tried to rush back toward the heights, but it was already too late. French troops reached the slopes, bayonets fixed, drums beating, cannons following behind. The heart of the Allied army was exposed. The fighting on the Pratzen Heights was fierce. Russian units tried to hold the ground. They fired volleys at close range. French soldiers pressed forward. The slope was steep. The air was cold. Men slipped on frozen ground. But the momentum was unstoppable. Within a short time, French forces controlled the heights. Napoleon had split the Allied army in two. From this high ground, French artillery opened fire. Cannons tore into Allied formations below. The Allied army was now divided. One half was still pushing south. The other was trapped and under attack. The realization spread slowly among the Allied ranks. They had walked into a trap. By late morning, the battle had already been decided. The Allied plan had collapsed. Napoleon stood on the Pratzen Heights, watching his enemy fall apart. What remained was destruction, retreat, and panic. And the worst was still to come. Once the Pratzen Heights were lost, the Allied army stopped being an army. It became fragments. Orders no longer made sense. Units could not see each other. Commanders argued over what was happening. From the heights, Napoleon could see everything. The enemy center was broken. The southern columns were isolated. The northern wing was confused and leaderless. Austerlitz was no longer a battle. It was an unraveling. Down in the low ground near Telnitz and Sokolnitz, Allied troops were still fighting hard. They believed they were close to victory. Then they heard cannon fire behind them. They turned. French troops were now on the heights. The road back was threatened. Panic spread slowly at first. Then, all at once, officers shouted conflicting orders. Messengers failed to return. Entire units stopped advancing and tried to turn around. But the narrow roads were already crowded. Men pushed past each other. Artillery became stuck. Cavalry had nowhere to move. Napoleon had cut them off exactly as planned. Marshal Davout's exhausted troops had done their job. They had bent, but they had not broken. Now they pushed back. French reinforcements arrived. Fresh units moved in from the center. The Allied southern wing was trapped between two forces. What had started as a confident advance now became a desperate retreat. As French pressure increased, Allied resistance collapsed. Units abandoned formation. Soldiers dropped weapons. Wounded men were left behind. This was no longer controlled warfare. It was survival. The frozen countryside became clogged with men trying to escape. Napoleon did not rush blindly. He advanced carefully, tightening the grip. Every movement pushed the Allies closer to disaster. South of the battlefield lay several frozen ponds. In the chaos, retreating Allied troops moved toward them. The ice looked solid. It was not. As artillery and wagons crossed, the ice cracked. Men fell through. Cannons disappeared beneath the surface. Horses screamed. French artillery began firing at the ice. The explosions shattered what remained. The water swallowed men whole. This moment became one of the most famous images of Austerlitz. Later, stories exaggerated the numbers, but the fear was real. To the men there, it felt like the world was ending. Napoleon observed the scene calmly. He did not celebrate. He understood what he was witnessing. An enemy army breaking is not glorious. It is final. Once fear takes hold, discipline dies. Napoleon allowed the retreat to continue. Every step the Allies took weakened them further. To the north, Russian units tried to reorganize. They launched counterattacks. They fought bravely. But without coordination, bravery meant little. French cavalry struck exposed flanks. Artillery pounded formations from above. Every attempt to regroup failed. Napoleon's corps system now showed its full strength. Units moved independently, but with purpose. The Allies could not match it. Tsar Alexander watched the disaster unfold. He had wanted battle. Now he had it. The confidence he had brought into the day vanished. He realized too late that Kutuzov had been right. Napoleon had lured them in. There would be no heroic recovery, only escape. During the chaos, General Kutuzov was wounded. This further weakened Allied command. Leadership vanished at the worst possible moment. No single voice could regain control. The army was finished. By mid-afternoon, the fighting slowed. Not because the Allies held firm, but because there was nothing left to fight. Thousands surrendered. Thousands fled. Napoleon had achieved something almost unthinkable. He had destroyed a larger army in a single day, and he had done it with precision. The battlefield was silent. Snow was stained dark. Broken equipment littered the ground. Men searched for friends who would never answer. Napoleon ordered aid for the wounded. He allowed prisoners to be treated. This was not kindness. It was confidence. Austerlitz was over. The Allies were shattered. Russia retreated east. Austria sued for peace. Napoleon stood at the peak of his power, but victory carries consequences, and Austerlitz would reshape Europe in ways few could yet understand. When the guns finally fell silent, Europe did not yet understand what had happened. Austerlitz was not just another battle. It was a message. Napoleon Bonaparte had defeated two of Europe's oldest empires in a single day, on open ground, through planning alone. The shock traveled faster than any army. The Allied losses were devastating. Tens of thousands were killed, wounded, or captured. Entire units ceased to exist. Artillery, flags, and supplies were lost in huge numbers. French losses were far smaller. Still painful, still real, but nothing compared to the destruction inflicted on the enemy. This imbalance stunned Europe. Battles were expected to be bloody on both sides. Austerlitz was not balanced. It was controlled. Austria had no choice. Vienna was occupied. Its army was broken. Its Russian allies were leaving. Within weeks, Austria negotiated for peace. The result was the Treaty of Pressburg. Austria gave up vast territories. It paid heavy financial penalties. Its influence in Germany collapsed. For the Holy Roman Empire, this was the beginning of the end. Within a year, it would no longer exist. Russia retreated east. Tsar Alexander returned home humiliated. He had survived, but his pride had not. Russia did not make peace with France. Instead, it learned. Alexander studied Napoleon carefully. He would not make the same mistake again. The rivalry was only beginning. Britain remained at war, but Britain fought at sea, not on land. Austerlitz proved that no European army could face Napoleon directly and expect victory. Britain would now rely even more on blockades, money, and allies. The war changed shape. After Austerlitz, Napoleon reached the height of his power. Kings negotiated with him carefully. States obeyed him out of fear. He reorganized Europe in his image. New kingdoms were created. Old borders vanished. Loyal rulers were placed on foreign thrones. To many, he seemed unstoppable. Austerlitz quickly became legend. Military schools studied it. Generals admired it. Even Napoleon himself referred to it as his finest victory. Everything had gone according to plan. The enemy had done exactly what he expected. Few battles in history show such complete control. Success carries danger. Austerlitz reinforced Napoleon's belief in his own judgment. He trusted his instincts above all else. Often, he was right, but not always. Future enemies would learn. They would adapt, and they would wait. The defeat of Austria reshaped Central Europe. German states were reorganized under French influence. This angered Prussia. Prussia had stayed neutral during Austerlitz. Now it felt threatened. Napoleon's power was no longer distant. It was on their border. War was coming. Austerlitz was not the end of Napoleon's story. It was the summit. From here, every step forward would be harder. Every mistake would cost more. But on that cold December day, none of that mattered. Napoleon Bonaparte stood unmatched. Austerlitz looked simple when viewed from a distance. One army attacks, the other waits. The center breaks. The battle ends. But nothing about this victory was simple. Austerlitz worked because Napoleon understood people better than they understood him. Napoleon's greatest strength was not tactics. It was judgment. He knew how generals thought. He knew how rulers thought. He knew how pride shaped decisions. At Austerlitz, he did not fight an army. He fought confidence. And he won. The Allied command suffered from division. Tsar Alexander was young and eager. Austrian leaders wanted revenge. Kutuzov wanted caution. These goals could not coexist. Napoleon knew this. He knew that Alexander wanted a clear victory, not delay. So Napoleon gave him an opportunity that looked too good to refuse. Most generals try to look strong. Napoleon did the opposite. He abandoned good ground. He pulled back visibly. He allowed rumors to spread. His enemies believed they were watching him retreat. In reality, they were watching him set the stage. This illusion dictated the entire battle. Napoleon did not rush. He waited for the exact moment. Not early, not late. The fog mattered. The sun mattered. The position of enemy units mattered. He attacked only when the Allied center was exposed. This patience separated victory from disaster. Napoleon's army structure made Austerlitz possible. Each corps could move independently. Each could defend itself. This allowed Napoleon to appear weak in one area while concentrating power elsewhere. The Allies could not respond fast enough. Their army moved as one slow mass. Napoleon's moved like parts of a machine. Napoleon remained calm throughout the battle. He did not chase every fight. He trusted his marshals. This trust mattered. Generals like Soult and Davout knew their roles. They did not improvise wildly. They executed the plan. The Allied plan had one fatal flaw. It assumed Napoleon would react as expected. They never considered that the weak center was intentional. They committed more and more troops to the southern attack. Each decision made the trap tighter. By the time they realized the truth, retreat was impossible. Once the Allied attack failed, there was no second plan. No clear fallback position. No unified command. Napoleon had planned several outcomes. The Allies had planned only one. French soldiers believed in their commander. They trusted his judgment. When ordered to attack the heights, they did not hesitate. Allied soldiers, by contrast, grew confused as orders changed. Morale shifted rapidly. Confidence became doubt. Doubt became fear. Austerlitz showed Europe something new. Wars were no longer about slow movements and fixed lines. They were about speed, deception, and decision-making. Napoleon had changed the rules. Austerlitz succeeded because Napoleon controlled the battle before the first shot was fired. But the very skills that won this victory would later push him too far, and Europe would learn how to fight back. Austerlitz ended a war, but more importantly, it began a lesson. Every general in Europe studied what had happened. Every ruler asked the same question. How do you stop a man like this? News of the battle spread quickly. Courts that had mocked Napoleon fell silent. Ministers rewrote plans. Alliances were reconsidered overnight. Austerlitz destroyed the belief that Napoleon could be beaten easily. It forced Europe to change. Prussia had stayed out of the war. It had waited. After Austerlitz, Prussia realized waiting was no longer safe. Napoleon's influence now surrounded it. French troops were closer than ever. Prussia began to mobilize. Reformers inside the army studied Austerlitz carefully. They saw what had failed, and they began to rebuild. European armies learned painful lessons. Rigid formations were abandoned. Command structures were simplified. Mobility became more important than tradition. The old way of war was dying. Napoleon had forced that change. Russia did not rush into another battle. Tsar Alexander remembered the humiliation. Russian commanders began to study defense, depth, and endurance. They learned not to chase Napoleon's bait. This would matter years later. Napoleon exported his system wherever he went. Client states adopted French laws. Armies adopted French structure. Officers trained in French methods. Europe became a mirror of France. This spread power, but it also spread resistance. As Napoleon reorganized Europe, something unexpected happened. People began to identify as nations, not empires, not dynasties, nations. This feeling grew strongest in places Napoleon controlled. His success planted the seeds of his future opposition. Britain accepted a truth. It could not defeat Napoleon on land alone. Instead, it focused on finance and trade. It paid allies. It strangled economies. It waited. Britain played the long game. Austerlitz made Napoleon seem untouchable. This image protected him, but it also blinded him. Each victory reinforced belief in his instincts. Each success reduced caution. This balance would not last forever. Later, generals admired Austerlitz, but they also misunderstood it. They copied the tactics without understanding the timing. They tried to recreate perfection. Few succeeded. Austerlitz was not repeatable. It depended on exact conditions. Austerlitz reshaped Europe, armies, and ambition. But history does not stop at perfection, and the shadow of Austerlitz followed Napoleon everywhere he went. Napoleon Bonaparte's victory at Austerlitz was not just a military achievement, it was a demonstration of planning, timing, and psychological insight It exposed the flaws of overconfidence, the consequences of disunity, and the power of deception. Two empires were humiliated. France's dominance in Europe was secured, and a legend was born, a legend that still teaches, fascinates, and warns. In the years following Austerlitz, Napoleon reshaped Europe. He dissolved the Holy Roman Empire. He placed family members on foreign thrones. He expanded French control across Italy, Germany, and Spain. On paper, his empire looked unstoppable, but this power came with a problem. Britain still resisted him. The British Navy controlled the seas, making invasion impossible. Napoleon's answer was economic warfare. He introduced the Continental System, a plan designed to cut Britain off from European trade. In theory, it would weaken Britain. In reality, it created resentment across Europe. Smuggling increased. Allies ignored French orders. Economies suffered, and enforcing the system required constant military pressure. The strain began to show. Napoleon's first major warning came in Spain. In 1808, French forces invaded to enforce Napoleon's rule. What he expected to be a quick victory turned into a brutal guerrilla war. Spanish fighters attacked supply lines, ambushed patrols, and refused to meet the French in traditional battles. The war drained manpower, morale, and resources. Napoleon himself later called Spain the ulcer that destroyed me. Still, he believed he could recover. That belief would lead him east. In 1812, Napoleon made his most dangerous decision. Russia had stopped fully enforcing the Continental System. Napoleon responded with force, assembling the largest army Europe had ever seen. Over 600,000 men from across his empire marched toward Russia. This was the Grande Armée at its largest. It would also be its breaking point. From the start, the campaign went wrong. The Russian army refused to fight a decisive battle. Instead, they retreated deeper into the country, destroying supplies as they went. French soldiers marched through empty land. Food ran out. Horses died. Disease spread. When battles did occur, they were costly. At Borodino, Napoleon won the field, but at terrible cost. Thousands lay dead, and the Russian army was still not destroyed. Napoleon marched into Moscow, expecting peace. He found a city on fire. Moscow was abandoned and burning. There was no surrender, no negotiation, no supplies. Napoleon waited. Winter arrived early. Temperatures dropped sharply. Snow covered the roads. Men froze at night. Equipment broke. Horses collapsed. Hunger became constant. When Napoleon finally ordered a retreat, it was already too late. The Russian winter destroyed the Grande Armée. Soldiers marched through blizzards without food, boots, or shelter. Frostbite took fingers, toes, and lives. Cossack attacks harassed the retreating columns. Entire units vanished. By the time the survivors crossed back into Europe, fewer than 100,000 men remained. Napoleon had lost his army, and Europe saw that he could be beaten. After Russia, Napoleon faced a new coalition of enemies. Prussia, Austria, Russia, and Britain united against him. In 1813, Napoleon fought desperately in Germany, winning battles but unable to replace his losses. In 1814, Allied armies marched into France. Paris fell. Napoleon abdicated the throne. For the first time, the man who had crowned himself emperor was powerless. He was sent into exile on the small island of Elba, off the coast of Italy. He retained the title of emperor, but his empire was gone. Europe believed the danger had passed. They were wrong. In 1815, Napoleon escaped Elba. He returned to France, landing on the coast and marching toward Paris. Soldiers sent to arrest him instead joined him. The army rallied. The people cheered. Napoleon reclaimed power without firing a shot. This period became known as the 100 Days, but Europe reacted immediately. A new coalition formed, determined to end Napoleon's rule forever. The final confrontation came in Belgium. On June 18, 1815, Napoleon faced British and Allied forces under the Duke of Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo. Prussian troops were also nearby. The battlefield was muddy from heavy rain. Artillery struggled. Attacks were delayed. Napoleon launched repeated assaults, but coordination failed. Units arrived late. Orders were misunderstood. The old brilliance was still there, but the timing was gone. By the afternoon, Prussian forces arrived on the battlefield. Napoleon's army collapsed. Waterloo was not just a defeat, it was the end. After Waterloo, Napoleon abdicated for the second and final time. This time, there would be no return. The British sent him to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic. It was isolated, windswept, and far from Europe. There, Napoleon lived under guard. He wrote memoirs. He argued with his captors. He reflected on his life, his victories, and his failures. His health declined. In 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died at the age of 51. The cause was likely stomach cancer, though debate continues to this day. He was buried on St. Helena, far from the battlefields that had made him famous. Napoleon's story is one of brilliance and ambition. Austerlitz showed the world what he could achieve at his best. Russia showed what happens when ambition outruns reality. Waterloo showed that even the greatest commanders can fall, yet his influence never disappeared. Military academies still study his battles. Nations still debate his legacy. His name remains tied to both genius and tragedy. Napoleon Bonaparte did not just fight wars. He changed how wars were fought. Austerlitz is remembered not only as a battle, but as a lesson in power, leadership, and the fragile nature of confidence. Napoleon's victory changed the way wars were fought. It reshaped borders, alliances, and empires. It created myths that still echo centuries later. Historians often call Austerlitz the Battle of the Three Emperors, because three rulers faced off on the same field: Napoleon of France, Tsar Alexander I of Russia, and Holy Roman Emperor Francis II of Austria. But the battle was more than a meeting of crowns. It was the result of meticulous preparation. Every move was calculated, every deception intentional, every weakness a lure. Napoleon proved that war is as much about psychology as it is about soldiers and cannons. Austerlitz is also a warning. Europe's greatest powers believed they understood Napoleon. They believed numbers and tradition would prevail. They ignored his ability to manipulate, anticipate, and control the battlefield. That mistake cost them an army, reputations, and political power. Even today, generals study Austerlitz to see how overconfidence can destroy the strongest forces. Napoleon's use of corps, his trust in subordinate commanders, and his integration of speed, deception, and terrain have influenced military thinking ever since. The principles of mobility, surprise, and timing became core lessons for every professional army. Austerlitz marked a shift from rigid formations to flexible, intelligent warfare, a shift that echoes in modern military doctrine. Napoleon often referred to Austerlitz as his greatest victory. It cemented his reputation as a military genius. Soldiers revered him. Enemies feared him. Europe watched him. But this myth had a cost. It created expectations. It demanded repeated success. And eventually, it contributed to the very mistakes that would undo him in later campaigns. Austerlitz endures in history for many reasons. It was a triumph of strategy over numbers. It showcased human psychology as a weapon of war. It demonstrated the limits of arrogance and the value of preparation. It reshaped Europe politically and militarily, and it reminds us that genius in leadership is fragile. A single day can change the fate of nations. Napoleon Bonaparte's victory at Austerlitz was not just a military achievement. It was a demonstration of planning, timing, and psychological insight. It exposed the flaws of overconfidence, the consequences of disunity, and the power of deception. Two empires were humiliated. France's dominance in Europe was secured, and a legend was born, a legend that still teaches, fascinates, and warns. Napoleon Bonaparte remains one of the most powerful figures in human history. Few individuals have shaped Europe so completely through force of will alone. He rose from a poor Corsican family to rule an empire that stretched across the continent. His story still fascinates because it feels almost impossible. Talent, discipline, intelligence, and ambition carried him further than anyone around him ever expected. As a military commander, Napoleon earned deep respect. Many historians even claim that he is second in history only to that of Alexander the Great. His understanding of movement, timing, and battlefield psychology changed warfare forever. He moved armies faster than his enemies thought possible. He split forces into independent corps that could fight alone or strike together. He understood morale, deception, and surprise better than almost any general before him. Austerlitz stands as proof of that genius. At his best, Napoleon could read a battlefield like a map already written. He knew when to wait, when to strike, and when to let the enemy destroy themselves. His victories were not accidents. They were the result of careful planning, experience, and a sharp understanding of human behavior under pressure. For this, he is still studied, admired, and respected. But genius does not erase responsibility. Napoleon's ambition had a dark side. His wars were not defensive. They were driven by expansion, control, and personal power. He crowned himself emperor. He silenced opposition. He placed family members on thrones across Europe, not for stability, but for loyalty. He ruled as a dictator. Millions of lives were lost in wars that served his vision of empire. Cities were burned. Armies were shattered. Entire generations were pulled into conflict. The suffering of civilians, soldiers, and occupied nations was immense. The same brilliance that won battles also justified destruction. Napoleon believed history would forgive him if he succeeded.
In war, men are nothing. One man is everything. What are 1,000,000 men compared to a man such as I?
When he failed, that judgment became unavoidable. His downfall was not only military, but moral. Power mattered more to him than peace. Control mattered more than restraint. In the end, he died alone on a distant island, far from the crowds that once cheered his name. Yet even in defeat, the legend remains. Napoleon is remembered not because he was good, but because he was extraordinary. He represents both the height of human capability and the danger of unchecked ambition. His life is a warning as much as it is a lesson. Greatness can change the world, but greatness without limits can also destroy it. In the end, Napoleon can be viewed as a great bad man. It must not be forgotten that over 1,000,000 Frenchmen never made it home as a result of his ambitions. But what he did achieve has earned him the reputation of being one of the greatest military commanders in all of history.
Chapter 5. Horatio Nelson.
Never assume a battle is won before the first cannon fires. In 1805, Britain placed its future on the shoulders of one man who had one eye, one arm, and a plan that many believed would fail. What happened next decided who would rule the seas for a century. This is the story of Horatio Nelson and the Battle of Trafalgar. It is a story about risk, fear, loyalty, and death at sea. It is about how a single decision, made under smoke and fire, broke the power of Napoleon's navy and changed world history forever. By the early 1800s, Europe was trapped in constant war. Napoleon Bonaparte controlled most of the land. His armies crushed nation after nation. Only one enemy stood outside his reach: Britain. Britain could not be invaded as long as it ruled the sea. Napoleon knew this. To defeat Britain, he first had to break the Royal Navy. That was the problem. Britain's ships blocked trade, starved France of resources, and hunted French fleets wherever they sailed. Napoleon's plan was simple in theory and hard in reality. He would gather the French fleet, join it with Spain's navy, draw British ships away from the Channel, and then launch an invasion of England. Standing in the way was Horatio Nelson, Britain's most famous admiral. He was brave, reckless, and often disobedient. He was also weak in body, scarred by years of war, and fully aware that one mistake could end his career or his life. The challenge was clear. If Nelson failed, Britain could fall. If he succeeded, Napoleon's dreams of naval power would die. Horatio Nelson was not born into power. He was born in 1758 in the village of Burnham Thorpe in Norfolk. His family was respectable, but not wealthy. His father was a country priest. Nelson's future was uncertain from the start. Rather than follow in his father's footsteps within the priesthood, he instead had dreams of being at sea. When Nelson was 12, he persuaded his father to write to his uncle, Maurice Suckling, who was a captain in the Royal Navy, and ask for his help in getting some sailing experience. Nelson's uncle replied,
"What has poor Horatio done that is so weak that he should be sent to rough it out at sea? Well, let him come. And the first time we go into action, a cannonball may knock off his head and provide for him at once."
Nelson joined his uncle's crew anchored at Chatham Docks in London. He took on the role of one of the captain's servants. Horatio was excited and thrilled with this opportunity. Although life at sea was brutal, food was poor and often rotten. Soiled water was also something sailors had to live off. Disease was common. Discipline was harsh. Young sailors learned fast or did not survive. Although the crews did have some volunteers, most of the crew was made up of convicts. Nelson learned quickly. He showed courage and curiosity. He asked questions. He watched how officers gave orders. He learned how ships moved with wind and tide. More than anything, he learned how fear worked in men. Due to his courage, natural talents, and his uncle's reputation, his career moved forward quickly. By the age of 20, he had become a Royal Naval captain. As Nelson rose through the ranks, war followed him. He fought in the American War of Independence. He sailed to the West Indies, the Arctic, and the Mediterranean. Each campaign shaped him. Before Trafalgar made him immortal, Horatio Nelson built his reputation in the violent naval wars of the 1790s. These were the years that transformed him from a talented officer into Britain's most aggressive and feared sea commander. The French Revolutionary Wars had plunged Europe into chaos. Britain faced not only revolutionary France, but shifting alliances that threatened its trade, its colonies, and its control of the seas. Naval warfare in this period was brutal, close range, and unforgiving. It was also the arena in which Nelson's character fully emerged. One of his earliest defining moments came in 1794 during the siege of Calvi in Corsica. While directing naval gunfire against French positions, Nelson was struck in the face by flying debris. The injury permanently damaged the sight in his right eye. Many officers would have taken this as reason to step back from active combat. Nelson did the opposite. He returned to duty quickly and treated the wound as proof of commitment rather than misfortune. 2 years later came the battle that first made his name known across Britain. The Battle of Cape St. Vincent, 14th of February, 1797. The British fleet, commanded by Admiral Sir John Jervis, encountered a much larger Spanish fleet off the coast of Portugal. The Spanish outnumbered the British significantly. In traditional naval doctrine, numbers mattered. Breaking formation was dangerous and often punishable. But Nelson believed hesitation was worse than risk. When he saw part of the Spanish fleet attempting to regroup and potentially escape, Nelson made a decision without waiting for direct orders. He turned his ship, HMS Captain, out of line and sailed straight toward the larger enemy formation. It was technically disobedience. It was also decisive. What followed was close, chaotic fighting at point-blank range. Nelson's ship engaged multiple Spanish vessels in succession. In one of the most dramatic moments of the battle, Nelson led a boarding action from his own ship onto the Spanish San Nicolas and then from there directly onto the larger San Josef. Sailors later joked.
Nelson's patent bridge for boarding first rates.
In reality, it was reckless courage combined with sharp instinct. By the end of the battle, the British had captured several Spanish ships, and the threat had been neutralized. Nelson's bold maneuver had prevented the Spanish fleet from consolidating its strength. The victory secured British control of the area and elevated Nelson to national fame. For his actions at Cape St. Vincent, Nelson was knighted and promoted to Rear Admiral. More importantly, he gained something less tangible, a reputation for aggressive initiative. He believed battles were won not by rigid adherence to signals, but by seizing fleeting opportunity. Later, in 1797, during the attack on Santa Cruz de Tenerife, that same aggressiveness came at a severe personal cost. Nelson led a landing assault against Spanish defenses. The attack failed. During the fighting, he was struck by grape shot and his right arm was shattered. It had to be amputated. The loss of his arm could have ended his career. Instead, it deepened his resolve. He learned to write and function one-handed. He returned to sea within months. The physical damage only intensified his sense that he was marked by fate preserved for something greater. In August 1798, Nelson delivered the victory that truly transformed him into a national hero, the Battle of the Nile, also known as the Battle of Aboukir Bay. The French fleet, anchored off the coast of Egypt, was supporting Napoleon's ambitious campaign in the Middle East. If France could hold Egypt, it threatened Britain's trade routes to India, the lifeline of the empire. When Nelson located the French fleet on the 1st of August 1798, he faced a strong defensive position. The French ships were anchored in a line close to the shore, their broadsides ready to fire at any British approach from seaward. Many commanders would have attacked cautiously or waited until morning. Nelson did neither. As dusk fell, he ordered an immediate assault. In a bold and unexpected move, British ships sailed not only on the seaward side of the French line, but also between the French fleet and the shallow shoreline, a gap the French believed was too dangerous to navigate. The result was devastating. French ships were caught between two lines of British fire, unable to respond effectively. The battle raged through the night. The French flagship L'Orient eventually exploded in a massive fireball that lit up the entire bay. By morning, the French fleet had been shattered. Napoleon's army was effectively stranded in Egypt, cut off from reinforcement and support. The victory at the Nile did more than destroy ships. It broke French naval power in the eastern Mediterranean and elevated Nelson to near mythic status in Britain. From that point on, he was not merely a capable admiral, he was seen as the defender of empire. Nelson achieved something that was considered astounding. Capturing one or two ships would have been seen as a great success, but instead, Nelson captured 10. He was now known as the Hero of the Nile. It was at the Nile that Nelson proved something essential. He would attack aggressively, even in darkness, even against strong positions, trusting in speed, surprise, and the fighting spirit of his captains. The pattern that would culminate at Trafalgar was already clear. Nelson became what could have been called a national celebrity. and Nelson did not shy away from his fame or admiration. The Sultan of Turkey once presented Nelson with a diamond spray mounted with a clockwork rotating star. Nelson displayed this like a trophy and wore it in his hat, much to the amusement of his officers.
He looked more like a prince of the opera than a conqueror of the Nile.
By the end of the 1790s, Nelson had become known not merely as a competent officer, but as a commander who thrived in decisive combat. He combined personal bravery with a willingness to act independently when the moment demanded it. These qualities would define his later victories. Cape St. Vincent in particular showed the core of Nelson's philosophy: close with the enemy, break their cohesion, and fight at close range where morale and leadership matter more than numbers. Nelson believed that bold action won battles. He hated slow plans and strict rules. He believed that captains should think for themselves. This belief would later shape his greatest victory. The legend of Trafalgar did not begin in 1805. It began in the 1790s in smoke, splintered wood, and the refusal of one officer to wait for permission when opportunity appeared. No account of Horatio Nelson is complete without facing a deeply uncomfortable truth. The same man who inspired loyalty at sea often failed the people closest to him on land. In 1787, Nelson married Frances Nisbet, a young widow from the Caribbean. At the time, Nelson was not yet famous. He was ambitious, often insecure, and deeply in need of stability. Frances offered that stability. She was loyal, patient, and fully devoted to him. During Nelson's early years of service, Frances endured long separations. She waited while he sailed for months and years at a time. She managed his affairs. She wrote supportive letters filled with concern and affection. When Nelson returned wounded from battle, Frances cared for him personally. After he lost his arm in 1797, she nursed him through pain, infection, and depression. She helped him dress, eat, and regain strength. Her devotion was constant and unquestionable. Through her deep care and constant support, not only as his wife, but also his nurse, Nelson was able to sail again. In fact, it is not a stretch to say that Frances saved his life more than once. As Nelson's fame grew, the marriage began to change. Nelson became increasingly distant from his wife. He wrote less often. When he did write, his letters were formal and cold. He criticized Frances for small things. He accused her of not understanding him. He complained that she did not share his interests. These complaints ignored the reality that Frances had sacrificed much of her life waiting for him. Nelson's success brought him admiration, praise, and attention. He enjoyed it. Frances, by contrast, lived quietly and privately. This difference became a source of tension. Rather than protect his wife, Nelson pushed her aside. In 1798, Nelson met Emma Hamilton in Naples. Emma was the wife of the British ambassador, Sir William Hamilton. She was intelligent, emotional, outspoken, and publicly admired. She moved easily in high society. She praised Nelson openly and without reserve. Nelson was drawn to her immediately. Emma admired him as a hero. She made him feel understood and celebrated. Their relationship quickly became intimate. Unlike many affairs of the time, Nelson and Emma made little effort to hide their relationship. They lived together openly. They wrote passionate letters. Society knew. Frances knew. Nelson did not deny it. Instead, he effectively abandoned his wife. He separated from Frances and offered little financial support. He rarely acknowledged her publicly. His letters to her became distant and sometimes harsh. Frances was humiliated. She remained legally married to Nelson but was excluded from his life. Emma became Nelson's emotional refuge. She praised him when others questioned him. She supported him during political criticism. She offered affection without restraint. But this relationship also came with cost. Emma lived lavishly. Debt followed her. Scandal surrounded them both. Nelson accepted this without hesitation. In private, he defended Emma fiercely. In public, he accepted damage to his reputation. Nelson's relationship with Emma Hamilton has often been simplified or mocked. In reality, it revealed his loneliness. He spent years away from home, surrounded by danger. Emma offered warmth, admiration, and stability that naval life denied him. Their letters show vulnerability, fear, and doubt. Nelson was not only a warrior, he was human. This humanity shaped his leadership. He understood emotion because he lived with it. Nelson expected absolute loyalty from his men. He did not offer the same loyalty to his wife. This contradiction is difficult to ignore. He was capable of deep care and deep neglect at the same time. It complicates the image of the hero. Nelson's personal life does not erase his achievements, but it does reveal a man driven by need, admiration, and emotional extremes. He could be generous, inspiring, and brave. He could also be selfish and unkind. This tension makes him more human, not less. It reminds us that greatness in one area does not guarantee goodness in all others. This also teaches us that when we look at figures from history, it shows that one does not have to be perfect in order to be considered great or even legendary. When it comes to Nelson, we can safely say that he was brave, dedicated, exceptional, inspiring, and ultimately a hero who died for his country. But he was also flawed, capable of immoral decisions, cold, and had the capacity, especially in his private life, of being cruel. These negative aspects of his character does not dismiss the fact that he remains a great figure in history and that ultimately his dedication to his duty and country not only saved Britain, but cost him his life. With all historical figures, from Alexander the Great to Julius Caesar, from Joan of Arc to Queen Elizabeth I, from Napoleon to Ulysses S. Grant, they are all considered legends from history, but in the end, they were also all human. Nelson rarely rested. Even when ill, he returned to command. He feared being forgotten. He feared losing purpose. These fears drove him forward. At Trafalgar, he knew the risk. He accepted it. That acceptance was not reckless. It was deliberate. As time passed, Horatio Nelson's image hardened into marble and bronze, but the man himself was far more fragile. Understanding this helps explain both his success and his fate. Nelson lived with constant pain. The loss of his arm never healed cleanly. Infection troubled him. His damaged eye caused headaches and weakness. He suffered from seasickness throughout his career, even as an admiral. Despite this, he never stayed ashore long. The sea pulled him back. To understand why Trafalgar mattered so much, it is important to understand what life at sea was really like for the men who fought there. Naval warfare in the early 19th century was not clean or distant. It was close, loud, confusing, and brutal. British sailors often joined the Navy young. Some volunteered, but many were pressed into service. Press gangs roamed port towns and forced men onto ships. Once aboard, a sailor could be gone for years. Daily life was hard. Food was basic and often rotten. Salted meat, hard biscuits, and weak beer were common. Fresh food was rare. Disease killed more sailors than enemy guns. Discipline was strict. Flogging was used to punish theft, disobedience, or desertion. Yet despite this, morale in the Royal Navy was often higher than in rival fleets. Pay was more reliable. Promotion was possible. Victory brought prize money. Nelson understood his men. He spoke to them plainly. He walked the decks. He remembered names. Sailors believed he cared about them, and that belief mattered in battle. French and Spanish crews lived differently. Many were poorly paid. Training was inconsistent. After years trapped in port by British blockades, morale was low. Ships sat idle while supplies ran short. Napoleon blamed his admirals for this weakness, but the truth was simple. Britain ruled the sea long before Trafalgar. Nelson was the sharp edge of that power. By 1805, Nelson was already a legend. He had won major victories at the Nile and Copenhagen. His name inspired confidence in Britain and fear in France. Napoleon, meanwhile, was building his power. He gathered ships in French and Spanish ports. His admirals were skilled but cautious. They feared Nelson and the Royal Navy. The combined French and Spanish fleet gathered under Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve. The combined fleet that faced Nelson at Trafalgar looked powerful on paper. 33 ships of the line, many larger than British ships, waited under Villeneuve's command. But numbers hid serious weaknesses. Crews were inexperienced and poorly trained. Many sailors were new. Some had barely practiced firing their guns, and many officers had not fought a major sea battle. Supplies were poor. Communication between French and Spanish captains was strained. Nelson knew this. He also knew time was running out. If Villeneuve escaped and joined other fleets, Britain would be in danger. Villeneuve himself was cautious. He knew Nelson was near. He doubted his own fleet's readiness. When Villeneuve finally sailed, it was not from confidence but from pressure. Napoleon had lost patience. Orders were unclear. Delay was no longer an option. In the months before the battle, Nelson hunted Villeneuve across the Atlantic and back again. Fleets sailed thousands of miles without ever meeting. The chase exhausted crews and ships. When Villeneuve finally anchored at Cadiz, he was trapped. British ships waited outside the harbor, watching day and night. Nelson knew the enemy would have to sail eventually. On October 19th, Villeneuve made his move. He sailed out with the combined fleet. 2 days later, the British fleet was in position. Then, near Cape Trafalgar, off the coast of Spain, the two fleets finally met. Nelson commanded 27 British ships. Villeneuve had 33 ships. The odds were against Britain. Traditional naval tactics said fleets should form long lines and fire broadside to broadside. Nelson rejected this. His plan was risky. He would divide his fleet into 2 columns and sail straight into the enemy line. This would break their formation and force close combat. British gunners were faster and more accurate. At close range, that advantage would matter. Many captains were nervous. If the enemy fired first, British ships could be destroyed before they could reply. Nelson accepted the risk. Nelson spent the night before battle writing letters. He wrote to his lover, Emma Hamilton. He wrote to his friends. He knew he might not survive. On the morning of October 21st, 1805, the wind was light, the sea was calm. Crews prepared for battle. Guns were loaded, decks were cleared, surgeons waited below. Nelson gathered his captains before the battle. He explained his plan clearly and simply. No complex signals would be needed once fighting began. Every captain knew the goal: break the line and fight at close range. This meeting mattered. It meant that once battle began, each captain could act freely without waiting for orders. Nelson walked the deck of his ship, HMS Victory. He wore his full uniform, covered in medals. Officers warned him that he was an easy target. Nelson refused to change. He believed it was his duty to be seen. Before the battle, Nelson sent a signal to the fleet. It would become one of the most famous messages in history.
England expects that every man will do his duty.
The signals spread across the ships. Sailors cheered. Fear mixed with pride. At dawn, the enemy fleet was visible on the horizon. British ships formed into 2 columns. Nelson led one. Admiral Collingwood led the other. The approach was slow. For nearly an hour, British ships took fire without replying. Cannonballs smashed masts. Men were cut down. Still they advanced. As the British ships advanced, enemy cannon fire tore through sails and rigging. Men were killed before they could return fire. Ships pushed forward anyway. Nelson's column cut through the enemy line. Fighting became chaotic. Smoke filled the air. Ships crashed into each other. Muskets fired from decks and rigging. The HMS Victory came alongside the French flagship Bucentaure. At point-blank range, Victory fired a full broadside into Bucentaure's stern. The HMS Temeraire followed Victory through the gap. Almost immediately, the Bucentaure was engaged by 2 enemy ships at once. Temeraire's crew fought with discipline and aggression. When one enemy ship attempted to board, British sailors counterattacked, driving them back at sword point. Temeraire would later be remembered as the ship that saved Victory from being overwhelmed. The effect was devastating. Cannonballs tore through decks packed with sailors. Guns were smashed from their mounts. Officers were killed where they stood. Bucentaure was crippled within minutes. This single moment broke the enemy center. With their flagship disabled, French coordination collapsed. British sailors fired faster. They aimed low, smashing hulls and killing gun crews. French and Spanish fire was slower and often aimed too high. Boarding actions followed. Men fought hand-to-hand with swords, pistols, and axes. Smoke was so thick that sailors could not see the length of the deck. To the south, Admiral Collingwood led the second column aboard HMS Royal Sovereign. His ship reached the enemy line first. Royal Sovereign smashed into the Spanish ship Santa Ana and unleashed a devastating broadside. Within minutes, Santa Ana was crippled. Collingwood's attack relieved pressure on Nelson's column. The enemy formation began to collapse. All across the battle, similar fights raged. Ships like HMS Defiance, Belle-Isle, and Tonnant fought against multiple enemies at once. Some British ships lost masts and were nearly disabled. Others arrived just in time to save them. French and Spanish sailors fought bravely, but coordination was lost. Signals could not be seen through smoke. Once the lines broke, Trafalgar turned into dozens of separate battles. Smoke covered the sea. Flags were torn down. Orders were shouted and misunderstood. British boarding parties swarmed enemy decks. Marines fired from rigging. Officers fought beside common sailors. Ships drifted into each other. Some caught fire. Others lost steering and spun helplessly.
We were engaging on both sides. Every gun was going off. A man should witness a battle in a 3-decker from the middle deck, for it beggars all description. It bewilders the senses of sight and hearing. There was the fire from above, besides the fire from the deck I was upon. The guns recoiling with violence, reports louder than thunder, the decks heaving and the sides straining. I fancied myself in the infernal regions where every man appeared a devil. The cries of the wounded had rang through all parts of the ship. 2 of the boys stationed on the quarterdeck were killed. A man who saw one of them killed afterwards told me that his powder had caught fire and burned the flesh almost off his face. Our men kept cheering with all their might. I cheered with them, though I confess I scarcely knew for what. The brave bosun was fastening a stopper on a back stay when his head was smashed to pieces by a cannonball.
Throughout it all, British gunnery remained steady. Years of training showed its value. The battle lasted hours. British gunnery proved deadly. One by one, French and Spanish ships were disabled or captured. But victory came at a price. The French ship Redoutable came alongside Victory. Musketeers climbed into the rigging and fired down onto the British deck. It was from Redoutable that the fatal shot was fired. The 2 ships were locked together. Boarding parties clashed. The fighting was so close that cannon could not be used. Eventually, Redoutable was destroyed by British fire. She surrendered, her decks covered in dead and wounded. During the height of the fighting, Nelson stood on the deck of HMS Victory, a French marksman, firing from the rigging of a nearby ship, aimed and pulled the trigger. The bullet struck Nelson in the shoulder. It passed through his lung and lodged in his spine. He collapsed. Nelson was carried below deck. He knew he was dying. He asked if the battle was won. Officers told him the enemy fleet was defeated, and Nelson smiled. 3 hours later, Horatio Nelson was dead. As life left him, he repeated the words that defined his career. He had done his duty. By late afternoon, Organized resistance ended. Villeneuve surrendered. The combined fleet was shattered. The battle ended in total British victory. 19 enemy ships were captured or destroyed. Not a single British ship was lost. The victory was complete, but the cost was heavy. More than 1,500 Allied sailors were killed. British losses were lower, but still painful. Storms after the battle wrecked many damaged ships. Rescue efforts were desperate, and survivors clung to floating debris. Napoleon's naval power was broken forever. News of victory reached Britain weeks later. Bells rang across the country. Church services were held. When news of Nelson's death followed, celebration turned to mourning. Nelson's death became a national wound. Poems were written, paintings commissioned, and as a result, Nelson became immortal. The country understood that victory had come at the highest price. The Battle of Trafalgar ended any chance of a French invasion of Britain. It confirmed British control of the seas for the next 100 years. Trade flowed, the empire grew, history turned. Horatio Nelson became a national hero. His death made him a legend. Statues were raised. His tactics were studied. His leadership became a model. Nelson was not perfect. He was stubborn, emotional, and sometimes reckless. But he understood people. He trusted his captains. He inspired loyalty. Trafalgar was not just a naval battle. It was a moment where courage, risk, and belief shaped the future of the world. After his death, officers hid the news. They feared it would break morale. The battle had to be won first. Nelson's body was preserved in a barrel of spirits for the journey home. When it reached London, the nation mourned. His funeral was one of the largest Britain had ever seen. Crowds filled the streets. Church bells rang. The country understood what it had lost. Trafalgar ensured that Britain would never face invasion from Napoleon. It allowed British trade to expand and funded wars on land. Napoleon would win battles on land, but he would never control the sea. Horatio Nelson did not live to see the full impact of his victory, but his shadow stretched across the 19th century. His tactics influenced naval thinking for decades. His belief in aggressive action became doctrine. More than anything, Nelson showed how leadership could shape history. Britain's victory was not luck. It was the result of training, leadership, and experience. British crews fired faster. Guns were drilled daily. Sailors knew their roles. Officers trusted their captains. Captains trusted their men. Nelson's plan allowed initiative. French and Spanish captains waited for orders that never came. One reason Trafalgar stands apart from other naval battles is leadership. Horatio Nelson did not command through fear alone. He commanded through trust. Nelson believed that men fought best when they understood why they were fighting. He explained his intentions clearly. He allowed captains freedom to act. This created confidence. Unlike many admirals, Nelson did not stay distant. He ate the same food as his officers. He shared danger. Sailors saw him on deck under fire. This mattered. In moments of fear, men remembered who stood with them. Nelson also understood morale. He praised success publicly. He defended his captains when mistakes were made. Loyalty flowed both ways. Fear was always present in battle. Nelson did not deny it. He accepted it as part of war. He once wrote that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. His captains absorbed this lesson. French sailors at Trafalgar fought bravely, but their situation was different. Years of blockade had left them idle. Many crews had little real battle experience. Training suffered. Confidence faded. Command structure was rigid. Captains waited for signals. When signals failed, confusion followed. Villeneuve was cautious by nature. He lacked Nelson's certainty. This difference decided the battle as much as cannon fire. Napoleon was not present at Trafalgar. He was campaigning on land. When news of the defeat reached him, he was stunned. His naval ambitions collapsed overnight. The invasion of Britain was abandoned permanently. Napoleon turned his focus fully to Europe's land battles. Trafalgar forced this change. Although Trafalgar was decisive at sea, the war itself did not end. Napoleon would continue to win battles on land. Armies would march across Europe. But without naval power, France could not challenge Britain directly. British ships controlled trade routes. Supplies flowed freely. This financial strength allowed Britain to fund coalitions against Napoleon. Nelson's victory echoed far beyond the ocean. Nelson's funeral was held in London in January 1806. His coffin was carried through crowded streets. Sailors marched beside soldiers. The nation mourned as one. Nelson was buried in St. Paul's Cathedral. His legacy was sealed. After Trafalgar, no enemy navy seriously challenged Britain for generations. British ships enforced blockades, protected trade, and expanded empire. Sea power shaped global history. Trafalgar made this possible. When the guns finally fell silent at Trafalgar, survival became the next battle. For thousands of sailors, the war did not end with surrender or victory. It continued in pain, exhaustion, and memory. Many sailors who survived the fighting were badly injured. Cannon fire had shattered bones. Burns from exploding powder scarred skin. Splinters lodged deep into flesh. Surgeons worked for days. There was no anesthesia. Alcohol dulled pain, but screams echoed below deck. Some men lived, but never returned to sea. Others carried wounds for the rest of their lives. Pensions were limited. Families struggled. Victory did not guarantee comfort. Thousands of French and Spanish sailors became prisoners. They were taken to Britain and held in prison hulks or camps. Conditions were harsh, but many survived the war. Some prisoners formed friendships with their captors. Others never returned home. The human cost of Trafalgar stretched across borders. After Trafalgar, Britain invested heavily in its navy. Dockyards expanded, shipbuilding increased. Young officers were trained with Nelson's example in mind. The Royal Navy became a global force without equal. Not all historians agree on Nelson's greatness. Some argue his tactics were reckless. Others say his success relied on luck. But most agree that his ability to inspire was rare. Without Nelson, Trafalgar would not have unfolded the same way. Trafalgar did not end a war in a single day, but it quietly decided how the modern world would be shaped. Control of the sea meant control of movement, trade, and time. Britain understood this better than any other power. With no rival navy able to challenge it, Britain could move goods across the world with relative safety. Ships carried coal, cotton, sugar, tea, and weapons. Ports expanded, cities grew. Sea power allowed Britain to act far beyond Europe. Influence spread into Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Decisions made in London now affected distant shores. This dominance was not only military, it was economic. Insurance markets grew. Shipbuilding became an industry of scale. Naval supply chains created jobs and wealth. All of this rested on the simple fact that after Trafalgar, no enemy fleet could seriously contest British control of the oceans. Napoleon adapted quickly. He accepted that the sea was lost to him. Instead, he focused on land warfare and economic pressure. The continental system was designed to isolate Britain by closing European ports. It failed. Smuggling thrived. British ships found ways to trade. Neutral nations carried goods. Once again, naval strength decided the outcome. Napoleon's empire would rise and fall on land, but without control of the sea, it was always limited. Trafalgar made this limitation permanent. Technology changed rapidly after Trafalgar. Ships grew stronger, cannons improved, steam power altered movement. Yet naval thinkers kept returning to one lesson from 1805. Decisive action mattered. Training mattered. Leadership mattered. Nelson's example remained relevant long after his ships were gone. Modern historians ask harder questions. Was British dominance always used wisely? Did empire bring as much harm as benefit? Was Nelson's willingness to risk lives justified? These questions matter. They do not erase Trafalgar's importance. They deepen it. Trafalgar was not clean or glorious in the moment. It was loud, violent, and terrifying. Men died in pain. Ships burned and sank. Yet from that chaos came stability at sea. History is often shaped this way. Horatio Nelson did not defeat Napoleon directly. He removed one path by which Napoleon could win, and that was enough. On October 21st, 1805, smoke covered the sea near Cape Trafalgar. By nightfall, the future had changed. One fleet was destroyed, one nation was secured, and one legendary admiral was lost. History moved forward, carried by the wind and the choices of those who faced it. In France and Spain, Trafalgar was remembered differently. It was a wound. It was a lesson. French naval ambition faded for generations. Spanish sea power never fully recovered. For these nations, Trafalgar marked an ending rather than a beginning. History often turns on moments that feel small when lived. On the deck of the HMS Victory, amid smoke and splinters, Nelson made no speech. He did not know how history would remember him. He simply acted. That action closed one door for Napoleon and opened another for Britain. It shaped a century. Horatio Nelson did not set out to become a legend. He wanted to serve. He wanted to win. And he accepted the risk. Despite his flaws as a man, and that he is revered as a national hero to this day, in the end he was simply a very brave, talented naval commander who above all else simply wanted to do his duty. And in 1805, in command of the English fleet from the HMS Victory at Trafalgar, Admiral Horatio Nelson risked all and changed history. Thank you for watching. Join us next time for more journeys into the world's past. And always remember, those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it.